Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, WTFW with another fiction. What if Deku and Gami dive headfirst into heroism? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Kakin, Midoriya squealed, pushing past a crowd of young children. His best friend stood in the middle, absolutely swamped by the rest of the kindergartens. Kakin, I heard you got your quirk today, he continued, finally reaching the center of the crowd where his childhood friend, Bakugo, was. Bakugo turned to face his friend, a wide grin plastered on his cheeks. Hell yeah, I did. Look at this, Bakugo exclaimed, shoving his palms right at Midoriya. He watched in awe as Bakugo's hands lit up in a fiery fury, his ears filling with the sound of popping fireworks and nose with the slightest scent of caramel. Bakugo made a few more small pops before eventually putting his hands back in his pockets, a smug smile now adorning his face. Cool, right? He started. My mom's calling it explosion. I can explode stuff with my hands and… Oh my goodness, that's amazing, Midoriya interrupted, his eyes bright in excitement. How does it work? Is it touch activated? Does it run off your stamina? What if your hands are underwater? Can you still activate it? What if you're… Sheesh nerd, take a breath, Bakugo huffed, rolling his eyes lazily. Midoriya flushed, his eyes nervously trailing to look at his feet. He knew of his rambling habit and how others felt uncomfortable about it, but sometimes he simply couldn't help it. His brain ran faster than he could comprehend. It's bound to overheat sometimes, and his mouth simply acted as a cooling system. Of course, trying to explain this was fruitless, so Midoriya ended up submitting to the silence and waited for Bakugo to continue. Apparently, I sweat nitroglycerin or some shit, and that stuff's explosive. One spark from my hands and boom, Bakugo shouted, waving his arms in the air to emphasize his point. Midoriya stood in amazement as the other kids around them gasped and cheered. Wow, Midoriya finally whispered out. You're going to be such an amazing hero, Kakin. Damn right I will, Bakugo exclaimed. And once you get your quirk, we're gonna be the best hero duo the world's ever seen. With me as a pro, and you as my sidekick, nothing can stop us. Not even All Might. Midoriya nodded eagerly, brushing off the sidekick comment. Sure, he wanted to work with Bakugo, but he needed to be his own hero first. A hero that was strong enough to help, even if there was no one else around. A hero that could save everybody, no matter what. A hero that always smiled. Yeah, I can't wait, he responded. A hero like All Might. Sorry, kid, but it's not gonna happen, the quirk doctor stated bluntly, his bushy mustache flopping up with each word. Izuku's hands fell to his knees. His eyes widened, full of shock and disbelief. He wanted to frown, or even open his mouth, but he was just stuck staring at the man who had just crushed his dreams. If only he knew just how many times that would happen. No, there must be some mistake, his mother, Inko, exclaimed. The other kindergartens have all started showing signs, but… Pardon my asking, ma'am, but you're fourth generation, yes? The doctor interrupted. As far as quirks, I mean… Inko looked up hesitantly at Dr. Tsubasa, Izuku's quirk doctor, with a shy look in her eyes. Yes, of course, she started. I can pull small objects towards me. She demonstrated, pulling one of her son's many All Might figurines towards her hand. And my husband can breathe fire. Dr. Tsubasa looked at her, but Izuku couldn't pick out an emotion on his face. His stare was simply blank and empty. It unnerved the small boy. By the age of 4, a child should manifest either one of his parents' quirks or a composite of the two, he stated, gesturing towards an X-ray of what Izuku presumed to be his foot. However, early quirk research discovered one important finding. The doctor moved his hand out of the way, then proceeded to point at a bone in the pinky toe of the X-ray. It has to do with the absence of an extra joint in the pinky toe. Humans have no need for parts they don't use. You see, he continued, bringing his arms back down to his lap. And those without the joint represent the next stage of evolution. Dr. Tsubasa then glanced at Izuku, before turning his chair completely towards Inko. Izuku here has 2 joints. It's becoming quite rare nowadays, but Izuku couldn't brace himself for the words to come. Even if he knew they were coming, it would still hit as hard as it did. It's safe to say your son won't ever develop a quirk. The car ride home was silent. The way inside was silent. Even the lonely dinner, as the two waited for Hisashi to come home, was silent. Izuku had been in his room when he heard the first noise since coming home from the doctor. It was the loud sound of the front door slamming shut late into the night. He shouldn't have been up, but the poor boy couldn't get a wink of sleep, the words still weighing heavy on his heart. He listened as the familiar jingle of Hisashi's keys stopped, meaning they had reached the hook where they always went. He listened as his dad addressed Inko, who was still in the kitchen. He listened as the soft murmuring of his mother's voice started, the first time he'd heard it since coming home. He listened as Hisashi finally understood the situation. That was when he had wished he could stop listening. Hisashi's voice picked up until it was full-blown yelling. He could hear his mother crying back. Her soggy voice was a direct contrast to Hisashi's loud, violent screaming. He tried to shut their voices out as best he could, but it was really no use. Izuku wrapped himself up in his bedsheets, muffling out his tears until they were an inaudible sob. "Don't you understand? How do you expect me to work like this?" Hisashi's angry yell echoed from the kitchen. "He's our son," came Inko's desperate cry. "That quirkless freak is no son of mine. If the word gets out, I'll lose my job, my reputation, everything. How could you say such a thing? How can you be so blind? Am I the only one looking at the bigger picture here? We can have another child." Hisashi's thundering footsteps then stomped from the kitchen to where the bedroom was. A door creaked open violently, then slammed shut. Izuku could still hear his mother's sobs coming from the kitchen, now drowning out his own. He moved to lay on his side and pulled his tear-stained blanket up to cover his head. Clutching his favorite All Might plushie, he cried heavily into his pillow. "I'm sorry, Mama," came a small, helpless cry from underneath the blanket. "I'm sorry, Papa." Izuku didn't remove the blanket from over his head until he eventually fell asleep. But if he did, maybe he would have noticed the dark and towering figure that seemed to watch him from the corner of his bedroom. Or maybe not. The room was pitch black after all, except for a small, All Might night light plugged into an outlet right by his bedside. The figure was easy to miss, as it blended right in with the rest of the shadows in the room. It wouldn't be surprising if Izuku didn't spot it in his emotional state. What would be surprising is if he didn't notice how a second blanket, which just so happened to be his favorite All Might fleece, had been draped over him as he slept. Or maybe he did notice, and just assumed it to have been his mother. The figure in the corner would have to disagree, though. Izuku woke up the next morning to the sounds of birds chirping through his window. He had been especially warm last night, but just attributed it to his mother covering him with his other blanket. He squinted, realizing his curtains had been drawn open. He was positive he had closed them the night before. Must have been his mother when she came in to cover him. He drearily shuffled out of bed, looking at the clock. It was fairly early, around 7:30. He really didn't get much sleep last night. But despite the grogginess, Izuku managed to dress himself in a comfortable shirt and a pair of green shorts before dragging himself out of his bedroom. The first thing he noticed was the lack of noise in the house, as well as the abundance of silence. It was eerie, especially for a Saturday morning. His mom would usually make scrambled eggs, an American breakfast staple he had grown to love, and the smell would lure him out of his bed and right to the table. But there were no scrambled eggs on the table. In fact, there was no one in the kitchen, which was odd as his mom always enjoyed a fresh cup of tea these mornings. The second thing he noticed was Hisashi's keys missing from their hook. Izuku walked to the front door to investigate, only to find that his father's shoes were also gone too. His father rarely came home, as he worked a well-paying job overseas, but when he did, it was always on a weekend. Hisashi loved playing with Izuku, especially at the neighboring park. And on Sunday nights, Izuku would always wish that his dad could stay longer. But alas, on Monday mornings, he would be gone again, never to return until who knew when. However, his father leaving in the middle of the weekend was simply unheard of, much less on a Saturday morning. He hadn't even stayed a full day. Izuku shook his head. His dad was probably just getting some groceries. Maybe they had run out of eggs. The third thing he noticed was a note taped to the refrigerator door. It was written in his mother's handwriting, the slight curves to her T's and I's giving it away. Izuku pulled it off the refrigerator and brought it close to his face. Dear Izuku, just wanted to tell you that I went out to buy some eggs. I doubt you'll be up to read this, but I wrote it just in case. I'm not sure where your father is, but if he comes home before I do, please be good. Call me on the house phone if you need anything. You should remember my number. Love, Mommy. Izuku opened the fridge. There were still 9 eggs left in the crate. He sighed and closed the refrigerator door, moving over to the couch and reached for the remote. If he had his mother's quirk, he wouldn't have to reach. Flipping through the channels, he hoped he could catch some of the early morning cartoons he usually missed. Maybe he could find a new episode of Mighty Adventures, a popular All Might-themed cartoon show. He'd even be content with a rerun at this point. Anything to boost his dreary spirit. A noise came from the kitchen though, stopping his surfing in its tracks. He turned towards the sound, not really knowing what to expect. But he certainly wasn't expecting this. A tall, shadowy figure stood right between the kitchen and the living room. Izuku couldn't make out any facial features as a dark hood was draped over its head. The inside of the hood was pitch black, and despite his squinting, he could not see inside. The hood was attached to a long flowing robe that hung heavily over its thin form, the sleeves and ends obviously too long. A rope dangled from its neck, with a small stone-looking object tied to it. The gray oval-shaped item looked to be painted with swirls and specks. Izuku was torn on whether to feel amazed or terrified at the thought of a stranger in his home. He knew his emotions were thoroughly out of whack from yesterday, but even through his stupor and astonishment, he still managed to do what was considerably the dumbest thing he could have done in the moment. "Are you my quirk, mister?" Izuku stammered out, though not stuttering, just simply confused by the situation in front of him. "I am much worse, dear child," the figure said, a hint of sadness underlying in his voice. "This is the unorthodox way that Japan's death met his successor, where he has come to regret his retirement, wishing he would have stayed active for at least another decade or two." This is the first conversation Izuku ever had with Gami, who would go on to be one of Izuku's closest friends, and eventually a part of his new family. And this is the story of how a quirkless boy became the greatest hero that Japan had ever seen, while also becoming the first hero death in the history of existence. Izuku wasn't sure exactly how the situation in front of him had come to pass. His young, 4-year-old head was doing its best to process the words coming out of the figure. He was so immersed by the complexity of this whole thing that Izuku completely missed the fact that the figure had sat next to him on the couch. "So let me get this straight," Izuku started. "You are death." "I was death." "So you're like, not death anymore?" "Yes." "How does that even work?" Izuku sighed in desperation. "That doesn't even make sense." "I believe there are more pressing matters to deal with," he stated calmly, not at all annoyed by Izuku's endless questioning. Izuku looked up curiously. That was true. The figure hadn't really explained his purpose or objective to the boy yet. It made him wonder why a being like himself would reveal his existence to a mere 4-year-old child. A quirkless one at that. As I said before, I was the embodiment of death at one point, he continued. It was my job to collect and sort the souls of all who roamed in my territory. Wait, territory? Izuku interrupted. There's more than one of you. Yes, the figure put quite bluntly. There are billions of souls on this plane. I would get quite overwhelmed if I was alone. Ah, that is fair, Izuku murmured softly. The man continued. The role of death is oddly similar to an ordinary job. We are allowed to retire and pass our job to others, though not without serving a minimum of a century's work. A century, Izuku cried. Yes, that is the minimum. But many deaths work for much longer. I personally do not remember how long I worked. I stopped counting 5 centuries in. Wow, Izuku stammered. That's a long time. Yes, but that is besides the point. He paused for a moment, looking at the boy. Izuku couldn't pick up on any facial expressions, obviously, but by the way his shoulders slouched, he could tell these next few words were weighing on the mysterious man. Once a death wishes to be at peace, we are relieved from our duties. Someone else must take our place, though. Our successors are not of our choosing. He stopped for a moment, before continuing with his thought. No one knows who chooses them really, but the previous death must meet with their successor to properly teach them how to execute the role. It was at that moment that Izuku's 4-year-old brain finally put the pieces together. With wide eyes, he finally broke eye contact with the figure, staring at his hands while picking at them nervously. The boy started, his mouth failing him. I'm your successor, aren't I? If I had known I was going to place such a burden on a child, I would have stuck it out another decade or so. The man had given Izuku some time to finally process all that had happened within the last half hour. For the young boy, no amount of time could ever be enough, though. The figure had insisted they get started as soon as possible, as Izuku was effectively the new death as soon as he had laid eyes on him. Izuku learned exactly what his new job was. He had to sort the souls of beings who had recently passed and assign them a realm of the afterlife to wander. He could only sort one at a time, but once he held the soul, all the information of that being's lifespan would come to him. He and the man practiced a few times to get the hang of it. Izuku couldn't describe the feelings that washed through him as he held a soul, but he could describe the souls themselves. The souls looked like small puffs of light. They were all the same color, a light, washed-out yellow that faded into a white, almost like a light bulb. When he held a soul, he could feel the rush of information to his head. It made him a bit woozy the first few times, but Izuku had quickly grown to love the feeling. He had always had a passion for analyzing, though normally it was quirks and not human lives, but it was a passion nonetheless. Sorting them, though, was a whole different experience. When the figure first displayed how to summon the entries to the afterlife, Izuku was worried, and rightfully so. How big were these entryways? Were they two-way transportation? Could something come out of them? The figure, though, had patiently sat through his mumblings, and finally responded with a simple, just try it. And so Izuku did his best to copy the mysterious man's example, slowly swiping his arm in front of himself in a horizontal manner, while delicately concentrating on creating whatever the heck these entries were supposed to look like. He was considerably startled when 3 monochromatic flames appeared right before his eyes, simply floating in midair. There are 3 main layers to the afterlife, the figure began suddenly, startling the poor child even more. There is paradise, he stated, gesturing towards the first flame on the left, a white one that seemed to shine happily. For those who have done good in their lifespan, or properly made up for their evils. The figure then shifted towards a dreary, black flame all the way on the right, completely skipping the one in the middle. There is the underworld, he continued, for those who have committed considerable evils in their lifespan and could not make up for them. Finally, the figure turned to face the final flame, a light gray one that seemed to sway as if there was a light breeze coming from somewhere. Then there is purgatory, he finished. For those who had unfinished business in this plane, or have committed minor evils, and could not make up for them. Some souls simply wander purgatory because they are confused and cannot accept their situation. Unlike the other two areas, souls in purgatory have a second chance to be moved to paradise or the underworld, though that decision isn't up to you. He stopped talking, giving the child time to register this new information. It was a lot for the young boy to take in, but he did his best to understand the gravity of the situation. Somehow, through the muddy thoughts of All Might and Kakin and his parents and quirks, Izuku's head realized just how important of a job he had. Something he really couldn't afford to joke around with, unlike the earlier topics. You must decide where each soul will go. That is your job. What? The boy exclaimed. But that's a huge responsibility. What if I get it wrong, or I don't do good enough? What will happen to? You were chosen for this, he explained. They must have faith in you. Besides, if those who run each realm do not agree, they will simply send the soul back to you. Though, that is usually unlikely. I can only remember a few instances for myself each century. Izuku let out an audible sigh of relief at the figure's encouragement. Though, I must mention that each soul must be sorted and sent off within 24 hours of you receiving it, he added suddenly. This is one of the few major rules. The higher-ups do not take lightly when this rule is broken. Izuku's relief quickly turned to sheer horror. But there are hundreds of souls here, he exclaimed, swinging his arms around himself to emphasize his point. We've got to get started like right now. And so Izuku began sorting his first ever batch of souls, with the figure's guidance of course. It was a lot of pressure to handle. He was really surprised the child didn't break down at the sight of this responsibility. But Izuku managed to hold it all in, and honed in on the task at hand. New souls trickled in as Izuku sorted the ones that the figure brought with him, but never enough that he felt overwhelmed. He and the figure just kept working. They worked through the latest episode of Mighty Adventures, missing it completely. It had been a new episode too. They worked past lunch, with the boy grabbing a small granola bar from the cupboard. His mother still wasn't home yet. Neither was his father. It was around 2 in the afternoon when the child heard the front door start to creak open. He instinctively panicked, afraid that whoever was about to walk in would discover his secret. The figure managed to calm him down and reassured Izuku that only he could see the souls, flames, and the man himself. The boy still insisted that they move to his room once he greeted whoever was at the door, preferring to keep his mumbles about the souls and their lives away from prying ears. It had been Inko who walked through the door. She gasped at seeing her son on the couch, staring right at her. Fumbling her hands around, she stuttered out a slight greeting before rushing to the kitchen, clearly not expecting the confrontation, if there even was one. Izuku sighed heavily, before getting up to move to the solitude of his bedroom, the figure trailing behind. There were no grocery bags in her hands. Izuku and the figure continued to sort out souls, until the mysterious man told the child they could finally stop. They had sent away a good majority of the souls, and as long as Izuku kept tabs on which ones needed to be sorted soon, he could stop for the day. The young boy used the free time to plan out a new schedule for himself, concerning the souls and their time limits. He figured that he'd need to sort at least 3 times a day, and decided to correspond them to each meal. He would have to get up early for the morning ones, as the amount of souls he would accumulate while sleeping would be enormous. Izuku believed he could get away with eating lunch alone in the corner of the lunchroom for the afternoon session. And lastly, he could sort more after dinner, where he would have the most time alone. It would definitely be different, but he would still give it his all, as someone had chosen him for this role purposely. At least, that's what Izuku liked to think. It was definitely a shock being quirkless, and after hearing his parents last night, the child was feeling quite dejected. Useless even, as his own father didn't accept him. He was desperate to attach his newly fading hope to something, so realizing that he was effectively Death's successor, his brain immediately turned to the fact that someone must have considered him worthy. Worthy of knowing the secrets of life after death, at least. But that was enough for Izuku. He was happy that someone still saw potential in him, even when he himself was doubting it. The mysterious man struck up conversation with the small boy, once the silence set in for the first time that Saturday. He explained that all Death were gifted with powers to help them with their roles, though at this point, it was mostly for aesthetics. At the mention of powers, Izuku's head perked up. The figure let out a slight chuckle at that, or at least Izuku thought it was a chuckle. He promised to explain more in the morning, as today had definitely been long and eventful on its own. Disappointed, the small child nodded slowly and went back to figuring out his new schedule for school, writing it down in his quirk analysis notebook, with a few footnotes here and there. The silence was eating away at the young boy, as he tapped his pencil on the wooden desk where he often wrote his quirk analysis. "So, do you have a name?" Izuku started, seemingly out of nowhere. "I mean, I can't keep calling you Mister all the time." "Well, I won't be around much longer," the figure responded. What? What do you mean?" Izuku cried in disbelief. The mysterious man couldn't leave him yet. They had gotten along so well. "I did retire for a reason," he stated harshly. "Once I finish teaching you the basics, I'm off to finally rest." Oh, Izuku whispered. He did have a point, even if it did break the child's tiny heart. He started up again. "As for my name, I'm afraid I don't remember it. I've lost most of my memories to time itself. It happens when you work for centuries on end." Izuku looked up pitifully. How sad it must be to not even know your own name. "Well, I could," the boy hushed. "I could give you one." The figure turned to the child with a curious stance. "Well, I suppose that is all right. Just make it appropriate." Izuku grinned widely, bouncing in his chair. His mind picked itself for a good name that the man might enjoy. Something classy. Or maybe something more unique. Izuku wasn't too sure what his preferences might be. What about Gami?" Izuku murmured. The man shifted his head, but made no noise that confirmed or denied the name. Izuku became nervous and focused more on his hands. "Like Shinigami, but shorter, since you were a death at one point. It fits you, but leaves just enough mystery to grow into its own name, completely separate from its original meaning." The figure stared blankly for a few more seconds. "Gami, I like it." Izuku was pleased with himself, and Gami couldn't help but relax at the sight of the cheerful, 4-year-old boy happily swaying in his chair. Ah, the sight of childhood innocence. What a wonderfully ignorant feeling. Gami felt slightly uplifted at the fact that Izuku was in his own little world right now. Hopefully he would stay that way for the night. Then maybe Izuku wouldn't have to hear the fact that two voices were currently screaming at each other in the kitchen. Gami really didn't like that man. Izuku woke up the next morning with a groan, squinting as he sat up from his bed. The curtains had been widely drawn, and the early sunrise was seeping through his windows. This must have been Gami's way of waking him up, and while Izuku appreciated it, he sure wasn't used to waking up this early. The boy turned to the all-night clock that rested on his nightstand. It displayed a bright 5:34 am. In a red glow. Izuku sighed and turned off the clock so the programmed alarm wouldn't ring, then headed towards his desk. Adjusting to this new schedule might be harder than he initially thought. Quietly, Izuku pulled out the chair, before plopping himself down and scooting it back in place. Gami watched proudly as the small child waved out his hand, summoning the monochromatic flames effortlessly. He then reached a thin hand for one of the many souls surrounding the boy before picking it up and handing it to him. "Here," Gami stated softly. "I will bring you the ones closest to expiring. That way you can work more efficiently." Izuku managed to lift his tired face into a smile that simply lit up Gami's dull heart. He couldn't explain it, But seeing the young boy so happy filled him with such a warm and comforting feeling. It was like Izuku's positivity radiated off of him, as if it was contagious. He wanted so badly to get attached. But he reminded himself that he was only here to help Izuku learn his new role. After all, he retired so that he could finally move on. There was just no way he could let himself get attached. "Ah, thank you, Gami," Izuku whispered tiredly, grabbing the orb of light that his friend had handed him. Could he even consider Gami a friend? Izuku wanted to, but he wasn't sure the man had felt the same. Hearing him say that his stay was only temporary brought heaviness to the boy's heart. He enjoyed Gami's company so much, even though they had met less than a day ago. But who was he to deny the rest of a man who had worked nonstop for over 5 centuries? Trying to keep Gami around for his own happiness just seemed too cruel. The two of them didn't say any of this out loud, of course. They just continued to work in silence, Gami passing souls to Izuku as he sorted them. They flowed together rather well, like a well-oiled machine. The silence wasn't necessarily awkward. Both of them could tell the other was itching to speak. But silence was appropriate for the moment. For Gami, it was early and Izuku was still tired. He didn't want to wear the boy down more than he already was. For Izuku, it was early and his parents were still asleep. Sure, he wanted to talk with Gami, but the fear of one of his parents stumbling in on him sitting at his desk, seemingly talking to no one, early in the morning was enough to keep him silent. It was around 6:15-ish when the silence was disturbed, not by one of them, but by the sound of a door closing. Izuku froze in his tracks, completely still, and slowly turned his head towards the door. He could hear footsteps in the hallway coming towards his room. He turned to Gami, unsure of what to do as the footsteps came closer. Gami shrugged indifferently, but Izuku could tell by his posture that the man was panicked as well. Trying to get back to bed wasn't an option, as he would make way too much noise and give himself away. Nor was hiding under his desk, as whoever walked in would clearly see that the room was empty and start searching for Izuku, which would only lead to more problems. So Izuku braced himself as the footsteps got even closer, rehearsing a half-baked explanation of exactly what he was doing out of bed. But the footsteps didn't stop at his door like he was expecting. Instead, they walked right past it and continued down the hallway. Izuku let out an inaudible breath he didn't know he was holding, and slowly got out of the desk chair. Ever so quietly, he creeped towards his door and pressed his ear against the hardwood. Gami followed him silently and stood at the wall next to the door. There, the two listened. They listened, as the footsteps finally stopped, reaching what Izuku assumed to be the front door. They listened, as he could make out the sound of shoes being slipped on and sliding against the doormat. They listened, as the familiar jingle of keys being taken off their designated hook rang out in the hallway, just soft enough that anyone asleep would completely miss it. They listened, as the front door opened, and then closed. Izuku managed to get back to working after the tension of almost getting caught, but not really. He and Gami had no further interruptions for the rest of the morning. It was only around 2 hours later, about 8-ish, that Gami insisted that the boy could stop, clarifying that the oldest soul currently still had 8 hours left before it reached the time limit. Izuku sighed in content, leaning back in his chair to relax. It was still early, and he doubted that his mother was up yet. Looking around, he figured it wouldn't be too bad if he left his room. So that's what the boy did, carefully opening his bedroom door, so as to not make a sound, Gami close behind. He slinked into the kitchen, grabbing the box of Mighty Smacks cereal quietly from the countertop. It was his favorite cereal, though quite sugary. He poured himself a bowl as best he could, spilling a bit here and there. Putting the box back and cleaning up his mess, Izuku took his dry cereal to the living room, where he softly dropped himself on the couch. Gami followed him into the room but trailed behind, looking around the room itself. There were few pictures on the walls, but most of them were of Izuku and his mother. They looked happy together, with the young boy smiling brightly in each one. Inko smiled as well, but nothing could ever compare to the ball of sunshine that was his successor. It was like Gami could see the physical waves of happiness rolling off the child in each photograph. There was one picture with Isashi. It was of his wedding day. He and Inko stood in the center of a large, white archway, decorated with beautiful red roses. Inko herself looked happier than all the other photos combined, holding her bouquet of roses with a gorgeous smile. Hisashi looked happy as well, though the man seemed to remain stoic most of the time. In this picture, it almost seemed as if Hisashi had been fighting back a smile. But there were no pictures of Izuku and Hisashi together, which Gami found odd. Sure, he didn't like the man, but it didn't make much sense for a father to not have any photos with his son. He had only been around Izuku for a day, but judging off of that, he could see that his successor didn't have a good relationship with the man, at least not anymore. Gami has thought that this was a new development, but judging by the absence of father and son photographs, he was afraid it stemmed farther than that. Of course, he wouldn't dare ask. The boy was probably still overwhelmed with all the responsibility he'd had to tackle in the last day. Gami didn't want to burden him more with bad memories. "Hey Gami, are you going to sit?" Izuku piped up, patting his small hand on the empty spot of the couch. The man didn't realize he had been staring at the wall for so long, but he nodded his head and moved over to the couch. The child smirked as he turned on the TV, immediately beelining for a specific channel. Izuku inwardly cheered as he saw that the channel was playing the new Mighty Adventures episode he had missed the other day. Putting down the remote, he happily smacked away at his serial content in the moment. Gami didn't understand the appeal of the show. He for one thought the main character, Mighty Man, was foolish and reckless, overall a bad example for young children to be looking up to. But seeing the smile on his successor's face, Gami pushed those thoughts away. If Izuku liked it, then Gami would give it a chance. Inko definitely was startled seeing her son up so early, watching Mighty Adventures while eating cereal. She really hadn't expected him to be up, so she fumbled out a good morning before rushing to the kitchen. She kept telling herself that her son must have some crazy new schedule, but in reality, she knew exactly what it was. It was the same thing eating at her as well. The part 2 nights had been stressful for the mom. She felt torn in two directions. She could understand where her husband was coming from, but at the same time, Izuku was her son. She couldn't just leave him. He was for goodness sake. She shook her head sadly, pouring herself a warm cup of tea. She just needed more time to think, that was all. Seeing Izuku up so early didn't really help with her guilt either. In the rush of the moment, Inko made a poor decision, the first of many to come. "Izuku," she started, suddenly pouring her cup of tea into a thermos. "I'm going out to buy some groceries." Her son turned to her, pausing his cartoon, looking as if he wanted to say something. His eyes were big, watery, and sad. Inko jerked her head away from him quickly, not wanting to see his expression or feel the guilt after. Unbeknownst to her, at her actions, Izuku grew even more depressed, feeling more unwanted than ever. "Oh, okay, Mama," he whimpered. Goodness, his voice sounded so pathetic. Inko cringed, desperate to leave the situation. "You know the rules. No leaving the house for any reason. If you need me, call," she repeated monotonously, quickly adding on, "If your father comes home, be good." The child just nodded his head, not trusting his voice to respond without crying. Inko left in a rush, not even bothering to grab a jacket or her purse. Gami could feel the sadness coming off his successor, and honestly, he couldn't blame him. What his mother had just done was harsh and ignorant, and frankly, he was starting to believe all the adults in this household were complete idiots. Gami had never been good with kids, but seeing the boy look so dejected left a sour taste in his mouth, so he did his best. "I did promise you that I would explain about those powers," he piped up. remembering Izuku's bright face when he first mentioned them yesterday. Though, I will alert you that they are not easy to control. Izuku's head shot up, wide-eyed and curious. But I suppose that will not stop you. The child shook his head, eager to know where Gami was going. The episode of Mighty Adventures was still paused. The man put his hands forth, gesturing for the boy to meet them. Izuku hesitantly raised his arms to touch Gami's. He was expecting that man to be ice cold, and he was. Gami's skeletal hands that peeked out from under his sleeves were so freezing. He almost flinched away from the touch. But the figure didn't seem to notice, now grasping Izuku's small wrists in each hand. The first ability I will educate you on is named Death's Touch, he pressed on. And we are starting with it first, because it is the most dangerous. The child grew doe-eyed at the name of this power. Death's Touch. Did that mean he could kill what he touched? Izuku shivered at the fact. Or it could have been Gami's ice-cold hands. He wasn't too sure at this point. Death's Touch works similarly to a decay quirk. He tried to put it in the best way for his successor to understand. It begins to decay anything you touch, regardless of the amount of fingers. That is why I grabbed your hands. It is known to escalate with one's emotional state. Well, that's fair, Izuku thought. He probably would have grabbed the couch in terror if Gami wasn't holding on to him. Your subconscious controls this ability, however. With the proper training, you can learn to control certain aspects of this power. We cannot practice now, unfortunately, as you would likely destroy many things in this house. However, we can tomorrow, as you will be outside for recess. The boy nodded at that. The woods during recess was probably the best place to practice. He just had to make sure Kaken or the others didn't go with him. For now, just be wary of what you touch. You may accidentally activate it. Izuku gulped nervously. How hard could that be? A few spoons and a cabinet handle were missing by the time Inko came home. Izuku had been sorting his nightly batch of souls when his father came home. He had tried to drown out the yelling, but nothing could do much against his father's harsh and violent voice. Gami was trying his best to distract him, but there was only so much the poor man could do. The boy just took a deep breath and intensified his gaze on the soul in his hands. He hummed quietly to himself, just a last-ditch attempt to fill his mind with anything but yelling. Izuku was sure it would pass, as it did for the nights before. He just needed to wait. Then, a slap echoed from the kitchen. His mother's voice stopped. Izuku froze in his tracks for the second time that day. All he could hear was his father's yelling, not his own humming, not Gami's desperate cries to grab his attention, not even his mother. The child didn't realize he had gotten up from his chair. He didn't realize he had left the safety of his bedroom. He didn't realize that he was now standing in the kitchen, shielding his mother's fallen body with his own. "Papa, please stop," Izuku cried, not knowing what else to do. He raised his hands out at his sides, trying to take the target off his mother. "You quirkless misfit," Hisashi yelled. "Get out of my way." He cried harder. "Please, Papa, please." I said get out of my way. Izuku didn't really remember much after that. Just that he was hot. So hot. His chest felt the worst though. It was hot and itchy, and the boy just wanted to scratch it. Although he did remember his mother's screams, hopefully she didn't get hurt. If only he was stronger. If only he had a quirk. Then maybe he could have protected his mama better. Her scream will forever haunt him. He also remembered Hisashi saying something to him, but not exactly what. What he did remember was the laughing. His father's laughter, bouncing around in his head, taunting him like hyena cackling, but with a slight cough to it. Almost like his father's throat was filled with smoke. His eyes were screwed shut, so all he could hear was the laughing. What was so funny, especially when Izuku was hurting? He wished he could have asked. Maybe next weekend, maybe next visit. The next visit never comes. Izuku woke up for school, the next day with bandages wrapped around his chest and shoulder. It still burns. Gami is at his bedside, asking if he is all right. Izuku really isn't sure. On his way out, the boy sneaks a glance at his mother in her bedroom. She doesn't have any bandages. School itself had really been awful. Word had somehow gotten around that Midoriya was quirkless. He hadn't even said anything yet. The children were just about as accepting as his father. They surrounded him like they did when Kaken got his quirk, but it clearly wasn't the same. He wished that they would at least stop hitting the spot where his bandages are. But surprisingly, it wasn't one of the punches that hurt the most. It was what Kaken, his bestest friend in the whole wide world, said to him. "What a disappointment," he started. "I can't have a worthless Deku as my sidekick." But Kaken," Midoriya cried. "I can still be a hero. We can still save people together." "You really don't get it," Bakugo continued. "How the hell can a quirkless, useless Deku like you ever be a hero?" Midoriya had never wanted to cry harder than in that moment. He felt so lost, so alone. The only thing reminding him that he still existed was Gami's hand ruffling his hair. The only thing he was looking forward to at this point was Gami's company. Recess can't come fast enough. So Death's touch works like a decay quirk. It affects both living and non-living things. Midoriya did his best to pay attention. Right now, this power is extremely volatile. You could end up accidentally decaying something you didn't mean to. But with the right practice, you can learn to control it better. Gami pointed one of his thin fingers towards a leaf lying on the ground. "Pick up that leaf over there, and then decay it." Midoriya went to grab the leaf, but just as he touched it, it shriveled up completely and wilted away. Gami looked a bit confused, but the child couldn't really tell. "Try that other leaf," he said, gesturing towards another fallen leaf. The boy went to pick up the other leaf, but the exact same thing happened. Gami didn't really know what to do. "Maybe try that rock over there." Midoriya hesitantly grabbed the rock, but nothing happened. He picked it up and tossed it from hand to hand. The rock stayed complete. "All right, now try to..." But before Gami could finish, the rock started to crack. His successor dropped the rock in something of shock and horror. The rock landed with a soft thud on the dusty ground, but continued to crack. Chunks of the stone started to flake off, before eventually the whole rock was lost to the breeze. Gami sighed. This might be harder than he thought. After recess, Gami and Midoriya had gotten a good handle on what he could and couldn't do with Death's touch, mostly due to Gami's experience with the power and Midoriya's analysis skills. Both were tired, but feeling proud of the progress made today. It was discovered that the power was harder for the boy to control on plants, but easier on non-living objects. Granted, the duo still didn't know where humans or animals fit on that scale. There was still a lot of work to be done, but the man and his successor were feeling quite good about themselves in the moment. That is, until Bakugo and the others showed up. "So Deku, where were you at recess today?" one of Bakugo's underlings sneered. I was just hanging near the forest," Midoriya whimpered. "So you think you're too cool to hang out with us anymore?" Another jumped in. "And no, that's not it at all," the child cried desperately. Bakugo looked at Midoriya with a side glare. His fingers twitched at the sight of his now useless friend. How could he do this to him? How could Deku ruin his dream like this? Suddenly, Bakugo's hands pushed at Midoriya's chest, and the smaller boy fell to the ground. Bakugo took a few steps forward and towered over his ex-best friend. He held out a hand, as if he was offering to hoist him back up, only to explode the air in his palm moments later, making Midoriya flinch further into the dirt. "Just remember your place, Deku," he scowled. "Don't forget exactly how useless you are." Bakugo turned and walked off, the rest of his lackeys following him. Midoriya sat up the best he could with the pain in his chest, and brought his arms up to his face and cried. He felt Gami's arms wrap around him, the soft robe rubbing against his skin. Gami's heart broke as the boy cried harder. Midoriya was out of breath, his small 8-year-old legs burning as he ran down the empty alleyway. He could hear the voices of Bakugo and the others behind him, way too close for comfort. He desperately pushed himself to move faster, turning onto a street in front of his elementary school. He looked around, urgently searching for a new place to hide. Suddenly, Midoriya felt a tug on his sleeve and turned around in panic, only to see that it was just Gami trying to get his attention. "Izu, you should be able to lose them in the forest near the schoolyard," Gami suggested, his voice oddly calm. The man tended to be much more reserved, but Midoriya learned how to pick up on his small hints of emotions. Gami wasn't apathetic, just unusually composed. But that was to be expected of a man who worked for centuries nonstop. He'd probably seen it all. Shaking out of his thoughts, Midoriya rushed towards the forest, the others hot on his tail. The boy had been lucky enough to shake them once today. He really didn't want to get caught and test his luck again. Weaving through the trees at the forest entrance, he ducked behind a particularly thin one. Even Bakugo, as smart as he was, wouldn't think to look for him there. At least, Midoriya hoped he wouldn't. "Come on, Deku. If you really want to be a hero, you'd face us head-on," one of the bullies scoffed. But Midoriya knew better. Facing them head-on would only result in himself getting hurt. He was heavily outnumbered, with Bakugo's group having a count of 4, not including Bakugo himself. As cowardly as they thought it was, Midoriya knew it was his best option. A tactical retreat, as he liked to think of it. "How did he even escape?" another whispered. "The wooden fence behind him just broke," the third murmured back. "It must have been old or something." "I don't know, man. It looked pretty new to me." Midoriya flinched at the last comment. He already felt bad about decaying the fence to escape. There was no need to remind him. He was just desperate. And you know what they say about a caged animal. "Will you extras just shut up for a second?" Bakugo shouted. The kids around him quickly closed their mouths. He looked around with an angry scowl on his face. "Deku has to be here somewhere, so stop talking and start searching." The other bullies scattered around the edge of the woods, scanning for any sign of the small, green child. Midoriya could pick out the identity of each one by their footsteps, a trick he'd had to learn, unfortunately, especially Bakugo's loud and harsh tread. He recoiled and held his breath as Bakugo's steps came nervously close to the tree he was hiding behind. He could hear the tree leaves rustling in the tense silence that surrounded him. Midoriya could hear excessive rustling in one tree in particular, much more than what the wind could produce. If the situation was different, he would have loved to investigate. He was still curious, though. Maybe it was an animal. "Ugh," Bakugo groaned. "He must have left while you idiots were talking. Let's just go." Midoriya let out a shaky sigh of relief at the sound of footsteps exiting the woods. His clammy hands finally stopped shaking as he clutched his chest. How close had he come to being caught? How close had he come to having a heart attack, for goodness sake? He spiraled down into his own mind further and further, his breaths turning to pained gasps. He could feel Gami's cold hands on his shoulder, shaking him lightly, but he couldn't hear the man's voice. All he could hear was the relentless taunting he endured each day at school, over and over and over and over and... Suddenly, a small mass leaped from the tree that had caught the boy's attention earlier, now breaking Midoriya out of his trance. He could now hear Gami's voice, but was more focused on the meager creature strutting towards him. "Is that a cat?" Midoriya blurted out. "I believe it is," Gami responded nonchalantly. The boy looked at it with interest. It was a small, black cat, with what Midoriya assumed to be white paws. However, they were no longer white, more like a faded shade of brown from the forest dirt. Its wide, yellow eyes stared up at the child, now having arrived at his feet. He never had a cat before, much less been this close to one. Actually, Midoriya had never been this close to any animal since he gained Death's touch. The cat rubbed up against the boy's thin legs, making him flinch further into the tree he was hiding behind. He reminded himself why he could never own a pet, as much as he wanted one. "The cat seems to have taken a liking to you," the man stated. "Why don't you bring him home?" "You know I can't do that," he answered somberly. "I wouldn't even be able to touch him." He looked down at his hands in anguish. "But you have progressed so well with Death's touch in the past 4 years." "Yeah, but I don't have any control over it with animals. I've never dared to try. For what I know, the second I touch this cat, he would start to disintegrate. He's better off here." Midoriya turned away from the cat sorrowfully, ignoring the creature's meowing. He slowly made his way out of the forest, but the cat wouldn't relent, simply sticking to the boy's trail. He continued walking down the street towards his house pitifully, doing his best to avoid listening to the cat's cries. Gami stared at his successor with guilt. He wished he had waited a decade or so longer. Izuku arrived at home a bit later than usual, but wasn't too concerned. He opened the front door to find no one inside, like normal. His mother was off working her late nursing shifts, the job she picked up once Hisashi left. Hisashi never came back after that night. He actually stopped contacting the family in general. He and Inko were still legally married, but he simply stopped coming home or sending money, forcing Inko to get a job. She took up her old nursing practices and found work at a local hospital, but she always took the later shifts. Izuku hoped that she didn't have a reason behind it, but inside he knew it was to avoid seeing him. Their relationship had gotten pretty rocky since Hisashi left. He'd like to believe that she didn't blame him, but he knew better. He hated how his brain was always right. Izuku threw his tattered bag onto the couch and searched the refrigerator for leftovers. The young boy really didn't feel like cooking for himself tonight after the whole mess with Bakugo. Luckily, he found some old katsudon he made from a few nights before, so he took that out and started up the microwave to reheat it. Gami plopped himself down on the couch right next to Izuku's bag and patiently waited for his successor to turn on the TV. It wasn't long before Izuku returned with a plate of hot katsudon, setting it down on the small coffee table before grabbing the remote. He turned on the TV, immediately switching it to the channel with all the kids' cartoons. Unfortunately for him, he had just missed Mighty Adventures, but the current show playing, Shurasagi, was still one of his favorites. Inspired heavily off of the pro hero Mirko, the show's protagonist was a white rabbit named Shurasagi, who was young and brash, very similar to Mirko's own personality. Shurasagi was a bit of a troublemaker though, and he often got his friends in all sorts of messes. They'd always have to work together to get out of those situations, and Shurasagi never escaped his consequences. Izuku liked that. He wished the real world was like Shurasagi's, full of friends and proper consequences. He was pretty engrossed in the current episode, even though it was a rerun, when Gami's voice snapped him to attention. "You know, Izu, I think you've gotten quite far in controlling Death's touch." "If this is about earlier," Izuku sighed drearily, pausing the show. "Look, I'm sorry. I simply do not understand. I know you cannot control it yet on plant life, but you have come so far with Death's touch in other aspects. Why are you still afraid?" The boy stared at his hands. "I'm just afraid that I'll mess up and hurt someone really bad." "What do you mean?" "You have learned to control it on humans. You can even start and stop the decay at will on them, as well as non-living objects. That takes an impressive amount of skill, and yet you have done it." Izuku shuddered at that thought. Learning to control his deadly power on other people was one of the first things on his bucket list, but also the most difficult. He really didn't mean to practice on Bakugo's lackeys, but they were always touching him, so he figured he'd touch back. Though he never hurt any of them, the amount of guilt he compiled from each time he tried really made the child fear his own power. "Well, I'm still afraid that I could lose control. One mistake and people would fear me forever. I can't take that chance." That's the whole reason I wear these." Izuku gestured to his hands as he shook them. His hands were covered under black polyester gloves. He'd started buying them at a local convenience store when Gami first started teaching him to control Death's touch. Of course, these weren't the original pair. He had gone through a good amount of gloves during the 4 years, well over a few hundred. As cheap as the gloves were, the cost piled up over time, so the boy had resorted to doing odd jobs for others in nearby neighborhoods. Most of the people here knew about his quirklessness and wouldn't accept him to do their requests. But the nearby neighborhoods didn't, so he often went there for cash. "I know you say I should be proud of my abilities, and I am, but I'm still scared. People already hate me because I'm quirkless. I just don't want them to hate me more for having a dangerous power I can't really control." Gami rested a thin, bony hand on his successor's gloved one. "I think I understand now. But I will tell you, no matter what, I will support you. You are my friend Izu, and nothing you do will change that." Izuku smiled at Gami's words. It was reassuring to hear them from the normally quiet man. He didn't have to respond, but Gami knew exactly what the boy was trying to say. The two of them had grown to understand each other, even without verbal communication. Gami patted the couch a few times, and Izuku chuckled before unpausing the episode of Shirasagi. Izuku and Gami had lost track of time, something they almost never did. It was too dangerous to do, kind of like forgetting to send a soul away before its limit. You just didn't forget those kinds of things. And so Izuku and Gami always remembered to file away into the former's room before Inko got home. But today was a different day. Maybe it was because it was so emotionally draining. Or maybe it was because Izuku was so exhausted from actually managing to escape Bakugo, a feat he never managed to do before. Who knows? It really didn't matter. What mattered was that Inko came home, and Izuku was still on the couch. Izuku knew that his mother didn't enjoy having to go back into work, but her taking the later shifts made it more bearable. Izuku liked to pretend that his mother didn't take the later shifts solely to get away from him. But one thing he definitely knew was that she took the later shifts so she could drink. The boy knew his mother gained a drinking problem once Hisashi left. It started out with spiked tea every once in a while and just escalated from there. His mother would often come home drunk, carrying a bottle of half-empty liquor she would buy after hours. It was a surprise the first few times, but after a couple days of picking out glass shards from his skin, he eventually learned to shuttle away into his room before she came home. Unfortunately, he and Gami had lost track of time. Izuku fumbled for the remote, and in a panic, shut off the TV. He ducked behind the couch, hoping his mother hadn't noticed him there. It didn't matter that the empty plate of katsudon was still on the coffee table. He doubted she would notice that in her drunken state, and he could always clean it up later. But as Inko's sickeningly sweet voice came from the front door, Izuku knew he would have to face the consequences of his actions, just like Shirasagi. "Izuku," she slurred, "is that you, my baby?" The child looked to Gami in horror as the man motioned for him to respond. But the boy's mouth failed him as he sputtered out silence. "Oh, Izuku," Inko's voice wavered, losing its sweetness. "I know you're there. There's no use hiding from me." He could hear his mother take a swig from the bottle she inevitably had in her hand. She let out a relieved gasp at the taste of the bitter drink down her throat. The boy didn't dare attempt to peek out from behind the couch, but visibly paled at the sound of footsteps coming closer. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he make a run for his room? Should he just try and wait it out? Izuku was stuck in his own head again, slowly drowning himself in his panic. He couldn't hear Gami urging him to just get up and run, nor his mother creeping closer. "What are you doing on the floor there, Izuku dear?" His mother garbled, leaning over the couch to look at him. She swung her arm holding the bottle over the side as well, spilling a bit onto the cushions. Izuku's nose filled with the pungent scent of alcohol in the air, as well as on his mother's breath. He looked up in fear from the floor, his wide eyes meeting the half-lidded ones belonging to his mother. She stared right back at him, an unnerving smile blooming on her rosy face. "Have I ever told you how much you look like your father?" Inko continued, as if not at all concerned by her child's reaction towards her. She reached her free hand over the couch to grab at her son, but he flinched further into the floor, away from her hand. She scowled at that, but pulled her hand back to steady her swaying self with the couch. "It made me so sad when he left," she proceeded. "How could you make your own mother so sad?" Izuku knew he was to blame for his father's departure, or at least his quirklessness was. But hearing it from his mother just reminded him how much of a failure he really was. He really wanted to make her proud, honest, but he just didn't know how. "Why, oh why?" Inko cried. "Why have you done this to me, Izuku?" Suddenly, Inko lunged over the couch towards her son. The child yelped and scrambled to his feet. He could hear his mother's jumbled words behind him, but the sound of his heartbeat in his ears was too overwhelming. An abrupt crash came from the living room. His mother must have fallen into the coffee table, which a following shriek confirmed. Izuku shuddered. That would only make her more angry. He turned the corner and dashed towards his room. The door was so close, he could almost reach it. Then, white-hot pain shot through his legs, and the boy wailed in anguish. He didn't even notice the loud smash that came after, or the now invasive smell of liquor that flooded the hallway. Luckily, he was just at his door and managed to hobble inside and shut it. His hands quickly flew to the doorknob and locked it as his mother's drunken footsteps scurried towards his door. Izuku stumbled back onto his injured legs in fear as Inko bashed her fists on the wood. "Why did you drive Hisashi away from me?" she sobbed. "Why did you have to be quirkless? Don't you realize what you have done to me?" The boy sobbed along with his mother at her words, though his cries were fairly drowned out. He could feel Gami's sleeved hand ruffling through his unruly hair, which made him smile a bit. He sniffled and rubbed his puffy eyes, taking the time to try and get his breathing under control. Izuku eventually managed to tune his mother's grieving out of his head until it inevitably stopped, and she shuffled off, probably still woozy from the alcohol. The child sighed in relief. It was finally over. "Izu, I think we should fix up your legs," he spoke softly. Izuku thought maybe it was because of the whole fiasco with his mother just now. But Gami must have seen everything in his time as death. He wouldn't be shocked at witnessing this, right? Taking note of the man's strange behavior, the boy turned to examine his legs. They were in rough shape, but not the worst he'd seen. He started carefully picking out the glass bottle shards and tossing them in the trash. The smaller pieces were a bit tricky, but with his tiny fingers, Izuku managed to get them out. Fortunately, most of the bottle missed his form and hit the wall instead, and any that did hit him only landed in his calves, so he wasn't picking out glass for too long. He was about to stumble towards the desk drawer that contained his supply of bandages, when Gami handed him the very item he was looking for. The child looked surprised for a moment, but thankfully accepted the help. Gami couldn't often interact with solid objects. He was, in all technicality, a spirit after all. But he did have his instances where he could touch something physical. After numerous months of practice attempts and many funny failures, the man did learn how to sit on the couch, and even lean back into it. He still had extreme difficulty interacting with anything else other than the couch, but there were moments where he seemed to be able to flawlessly. Izuku wasn't sure if it was out of desperation or something akin to extreme emotion, but it happened few and far between. As for why he had bandages in his room, well, he couldn't make it to the bathroom all the time. The next day was thankfully a Saturday, and on these days, his mother left the house early. Izuku didn't have to worry about accidentally running into her on his way to the kitchen, which was a blessing in itself. Though today, the boy seemed to be a bit slower than usual, somewhat less hyper. He didn't pour his mighty smacks as happily, nor make as much of a mess. He sort of shuffled towards the couch instead of his usual skipping, and didn't plop himself down. It was more like a gentle fall. But when Gami watched his successor skip past the channel playing Mighty Adventures, he knew something was wrong. Izu, you seem more down than normal. Are yesterday's events bothering you? Izuku looked down with a curious emotion on his face, one that Gami couldn't really identify. No, it's not that. I just had a really weird dream last night, and it's really bugging me. The cloaked man looked at the boy in interest. A dream? Do you think talking about it might help? Well, he started. I saw a man I didn't know in it. He looked a bit old, with fraying brown hair that looked faded. For some reason, I can vividly remember him wearing a bright yellow shirt. Izuku stopped timidly, but Gami motioned for him to continue. He, started to cross the street, but there was a car coming and he didn't see it. He just kept walking. When he finally noticed it, it was too late. The boy managed to whimper out. There was so much blood and it was awful. Izuku sniffled and rubbed at his nose, clearly not having enjoyed retelling his dream. The man stayed silent for a moment, unsure of what to say. Izu, I think you received another one of those powers I told you about. That was a power? Izuku cried out. I don't want to have to see that again. I understand that you are in shock, but that is one of the most useful abilities you will ever have. It may help you save even more people. The child calmed down a little at those words. It can. Yes, that is an ability called premonition. It allows the current death to view people who could die earlier than they are supposed to. Gami paused, allowing his successor to process those words before continuing. Normally, we are not to interfere with the process of death. However, we can receive foresight of people who are going to die before their supposed date. Those viewed in premonitions can have their fates tampered with. Of course, us death are not obligated to interfere. However, we are given that option. Izuku looked up at that. I can save that man then. Yes, but I will warn you. It is difficult to predict when a premonition will come to pass. They usually have a time frame of anywhere between an hour after you've first viewed it to about 3 days later. The boy's face morphed again into one of horror. So he could be dead already? Possibly. Izuku paled. Gami flinched a bit, but it wasn't noticeable. He didn't mean to scare the young child again. Do you remember what the sky looked like in the premonition? If it wasn't dark, then he could still be alive. Izuku perked up again. Yeah, it was sunset. He's still okay then. Gami smiled, though it wasn't visible from the depths of his hood. You enjoy analyzing things, so try to observe as much as you can during each premonition. That way you can have the best chance at helping the person in it. Normally, they appear as foresights during the day, not typically as dreams, though that must be because this was your first one. The man stopped to ponder that thought, before picking up where he left off. Although, you have to be careful when you intervene. Too early, and the person could still die. Too late, and that's self-explanatory. You have to interfere at the moment closest to death. The boy grew a bit worried at that, but shook it off. Well then, I guess we are going out to buy some groceries later. Izuku then switched the channel to the kids' cartoons, where Mighty Adventures was playing. Gami smiled wider at his successor. He was going to make such a wonderful hero. Izuku trudged towards his house, his arms full of groceries bags. Gami did offer to help, but with the man's sporadic control over his form, neither of them really trusted that he would be able to make it back without dropping at least one bag and squishing its contents. The sun was setting majestically, and as much as the child enjoyed watching it, he knew he had to head back soon. Being out after dark wasn't too good of an idea in this neighborhood. The boy was secretly hoping to see the man from his premonition, but took into account that his foresights could take up to 3 days later to come true. He knew it was unlikely for it to occur so early, but Izuku could only hope. After seeing the man's gruesome death in his own mind, He wished to spare him of that avoidable fate. He and Gami liked to walk and talk while they were out. Of course, they chatted sparingly when others were around or as others passed them. But at times like this, where the streets were eerily empty, they talked plentifully. After all, the man had been around for over 5 centuries. He sure had a lot to talk about. They turned a corner together, Gami rambling on about some odd quirks he'd seen throughout their newfound generations. The man knew his successor enjoyed that kind of conversation, and also knew he had somehow picked up the child's rambling habit. The two of them were so engrossed in the discussion, they almost crossed during a green traffic light. But Gami managed to alert Izuku once they got to the curb, and the 8-year-old stopped accordingly. They continued to chat though. The light turned yellow. As they talked, the boy noticed something odd in the corner of his eye. As he turned his head, the sight of a bright yellow shirt flooded his vision. Realization bloomed in his head as he saw the older, brown-haired man from his premonition crossing the street across from Izuku, right as a car was plowing down towards him. "Stop, mister." The words escaped his mouth before he had even realized it. Gami turned to look at what his successor was yelling about, not really expecting to see the man Izuku had described earlier. The man jolted and stopped at the child's scream, just as the raging car zoomed past him. Just then, the traffic light turned red. Izuku used the opportunity to run across the now empty road after looking both ways. He rushed towards the shaken man and tried to aid him the best he could. "Mister, are you all right?" Izuku asked softly, genuine concern evident in his voice. The man managed to get his breathing under control enough to respond. "Yes, thanks to you," he started. "My quirk side effect can make me go blind at random. I thought I could get away with crossing the street without my sight, since my house is right there." The older man pointed across the street, and Izuku followed his finger to see a beautiful blue house, small and quaint. "Well, let me walk you across the rest of the way then," the child added, "just to make sure you arrive safely." He then linked arms with the man, despite the numerous amounts of bags he was carrying anyway. With slow steps, they made their way across the street, Izuku making sure to match the man's shaky pace before reaching the curb safely. The boys still kept their arms linked and led the man up the steps of his house, right to the door. "Thank you," the older man stated once he reached his home. "You really saved my life, young man." Izuku blushed and looked away, forgetting that the man was still effectively blind. "It was no problem, mister. I'm just glad you're okay. Are you thinking of becoming a hero?" he continued. The child bounced up at that. "Yes, sir. It's always been my dream." The man chuckled. "Well, I've got full faith that you'll turn out to be someone great. And if you're planning on going into heroics, then I'll just have to keep an ear out for you." Izuku grinned widely at that, beaming with pride. "Thank you so much, mister." "Ishihara Tadao," he interrupted. "But you can call me Ishihara." "Ah, well, it's nice to meet you, Ishihara-san," the boy blinked. "I'm Midoriya Izuku." Ishihara smiled at the boy's antics. "Well, Midoriya-san, why don't you come over tomorrow for some tea? I really want to show you my gratitude for saving my life today." Izuku flushed again at the man's kindness. He'd never been invited over before, not even by another child. "Sure. Does tea work for you?" "Indeed it does. I look forward to seeing you, Midoriya-san." Ishihara walked inside his home at that, and so Izuku made his way home too. It was getting dark, so he had to hurry. But the boy did have a little bounce in his step. He finally felt confident in himself and his capabilities, and having Ishihara-san's support made him feel unstoppable, like he had a real shot at his dream. Gami trailed behind, having witnessed the entire escapade. He wondered why anyone had ever doubted this child. Most people didn't bother to pay any attention to a glum-looking 11-year-old as he trudged down a busy street. Of course, Gami was not most people. He desperately tried to shake his successor out of whatever funk he was in. It would not end well if he arrived at school like this. Midoriya was in a bad mood that morning. Normally, he did his best to start each day as cheerfully as possible, so he wasn't as crushed once he got home from school. He would wake up early each morning and watch whatever episode of Mighty Adventures was playing while he sorted out his souls. Gami would sit next to him, and the two of them would laugh together at Mighty Man's antics. Then, as they walked to Aldera Junior High, the man would ramble on about quirks or Mighty Man. Whatever it was, it always put Midoriya in the highest of moods, and that's how it was every day. But of course, not every day went without a hitch. Midoriya knew he couldn't save every person he saw in a premonition, as much as he wanted to. It was just impossible, like how every hero couldn't save every person in need. A grim reality that was hard to accept. Midoriya understood it, but that didn't mean he accepted it just yet. Maybe he could cope with it in due time, but right now, he was a stubborn 11-year-old child who just wanted to help everyone he could. Still, understanding that harsh truth didn't prepare him for the majority of times where he couldn't save whoever he saw. That morning, the child ended up pausing on a different channel on his way to Mighty Adventures. He was hoping to catch the weather for the rest of the week, just to check and see if he needed to do his laundry for more shorts. What he ended up catching on the news was far worse than he expected, though not the first time it happened. It was a picture of a woman, blonde and in her 30s, the exact same one from the boy's premonition 2 days earlier. The reporter was explaining how she had been fatally shot in what had looked to be a mugging gone terribly wrong. Midoriya had only been able to catch the fact that the police were still on the hunt for her killer before his mood completely plummeted. Sure, he knew he couldn't save everyone. That didn't erase the fact that it put him into a cold sweat each time he failed. "Izu, please," Gami pleaded with the child, frantic for some kind of reaction. Midoriya snapped out of his head at that, looking down at the sidewalk while continuing to walk. They were almost at the school, and the streets were starting to thin out of people. "Sorry," he mumbled out, voice dry and hoarse from the silence. He could hear the figure's sigh of relief at the response. Midoriya waited for him to say more, waited for the expected lecture about how he couldn't save everyone. He waited for Gami to go on about how he could still help people, and that no hero was expected to save everyone. He waited for what he heard every time this happened, and as much as he knew Gami meant it, it never helped as much as he wanted it to. Midoriya closed his eyes and waited. He knew it was coming, and he knew it was true. But no words came. Midoriya stopped out of shock. Gami's sleeve came to rest on the boy's shoulder, and he could feel the sharpness of the bones digging into his skin. Still, no words were spoken. The child reached to touch the man's hand with his own. It was cold, even through the sleeve, but he didn't mind. They just stood there. To any person that would be watching, it would seem pretty weird that a small middle schooler had stopped abruptly in the middle of an empty sidewalk and was clutching his shoulder. It would probably seem even weirder that the same child had just suddenly started smiling at what would seem to be nothing. But Midoriya didn't mind. No words ever broke the silence. Midoriya ran down the school's empty hallways, cursing to himself. How long had he been standing on that sidewalk for? Surely it couldn't have been that long, right? Somehow it was, as now he was racing to beat the clock, as well as the late bell. The last thing he needed to hear now was his teacher scolding him on his tardiness. It happened every now and again, where the boy didn't make it into the classroom on time, but never enough to deserve the lengthy criticism his homeroom teacher liked to give. He especially didn't want to have to stand there and take it in front of the rest of his class. Their obvious snickering always made it worse. Skidding down another hallway, he saw his classroom's entry door. Lurching for the handle, he violently turned it and yanked the door open. The sudden noise spooked most of his classmates as they turned to see who was at the door, only the smirk once they realized it was him. His teacher's head turned too, face morphing into a scowl at the sight of his green, unruly hair. "Midoriya, "I hope you realize that you're late," the teacher began. The boy just stopped to catch his breath before pointing up at the bell. It wasn't a second later that the bell rang, signaling that class had started and all students that came in after would actually be late. The teacher sighed and let his shoulders slump before motioning for the student to sit. Midoriya grinned and walked over to his desk, ignoring the snickers and giggles coming from his classmates. He outwitted his teacher for once, and that left him in a decent enough mood to not be bothered by his peers. That was until one of Bakugo's crew stuck his foot right into Midoriya's path. He flailed before inevitably falling face first onto the cold tile. All the kids in the classroom, regardless if they witnessed the scene or not, immediately began to laugh. Midoriya pushed himself off the floor before meeting the harsh glare coming from his teacher. His proud facade started to falter a bit. "Midoriya, get to your seat now and stop distracting the class," he berated. "Before I find a reason to give you detention." The child faltered even more. He never had been to detention before. That kind of thing stayed on your school record. And if he wanted to have a shot at you, he couldn't afford to start now. They would already be looking for a way to deny him entry due to his quirkless status. He couldn't give them a reason due to his school record. Of course, he was hoping to change his quirk records before the entry exam in 3 years. But in case he wasn't able to, he had to have all his bases covered. "Yes, sir," Midoriya murmured quietly before making his way to his desk. He could feel each and every glare on him as he finally sat down. As the teacher continued with a lesson, he could feel the stares slowly move off of his form. One in particular hung around longer than the others. He could practically feel the heat coming off of it and burning into his back. He ignored it, like usual. Bakugo was always like this after all. The rest of the classes before lunch went pretty smoothly. Not too much had happened since the incident in Midoriya's homeroom, and for that, he was grateful. When the lunch bell rang, he waited behind as the rest of his class filed out. He knew it was probably a better idea to merge with the crowd, but the boy wasn't too fond of being crowded. After years of avoiding others and lacking physical contact, he wasn't too keen on changing that on a dime. As for how it got that way, it was a combination of things. The lack of affection at home, the bullying at school, the fear of his own power growing out of control. Midoriya figured it would be just easier to avoid contact in general, rather than trying to fix the problem 7 years too late. Still, he should have realized by now that trying to leave the room alone would only cause more problems. "God, Deku," Midoriya flinched at the voice. "You're so pathetic. Can't you even walk straight?" The boy would never comment on how he was tripped. He was playing for the long run after all. Better to let them talk than try and correct them if he really wanted to outlast this nightmare. So Midoriya just ignored whoever was talking and attempted to leave the room. Of course, he would never be lucky enough to get out that easily. "Hey, who said you could leave?" Another voice called out and grabbed his shoulder. The boy recoiled at the touch, turning around to face whoever else was in the room. It was only those 2 students who had spoken earlier, luckily not Bakugo. Though at this point, Midoriya wasn't sure what was worse. He just stood there in silence and waited for the others to continue as they surely would. "Not going to say anything, Deku," the first one sneered. "You really are useless." The same kid started walking towards him, a malicious glint in his eyes. Midoriya looked towards the supply closet in the back of the classroom. The teacher had gone in there just as class ended, and the child was sure he was just waiting out the confrontation. They teachers always made it painfully obvious that they didn't care about how he was treated by the other students. The man could probably hear everything that was happening. Suddenly, the kid threw a lousy punch at Midoriya's face. He jumped back and ducked under the swing, before skittishly scampering out of the classroom. He hurried towards the courtyard, listening to the cries behind him, not too far down that same hallway. Midoriya hid behind a set of open doors near the courtyard entrance, just as the 2 students raced past him. He stayed there for a good few minutes to catch his breath, before making his way outside. This was a natural occurrence, and the boy was always prepared for those. It wasn't the first time he used this same set of double doors to hide behind either. He finally reached the courtyard of Aldera Junior High, and to his relief, it was empty like always. None of the other students really enjoyed eating away from the refreshing, air-conditioned sanctuary of the cafeteria, especially on hot days like today. This made the courtyard the perfect place to get away from it all, at least for a half hour. He could talk to Gami here and sort souls in peace. It was like a win-win. Midoriya casually walked towards the tree in the center of the yard. It was arguably the most beautiful part of the school. The way it thrivingly grew in a place so toxic really helped him believe that he would be able to thrive too, cheering him on like a silent fan. Its branches were tall and thick, like powerful arms holding the world up, and its leaves stayed a calming shade of evergreen despite the awful heat. It even had a knot right in the center, which Gami had told him held a family of cardinals a few generations back. How the man knew that, Midoriya had no idea. Now, the knot held the child's personal belongings, such as his occasional jacket for the colder days and his packed lunch. He stopped using his assigned locker after multiple defacings and vandalism incidents, as well as the numerous times it had been broken into. Most of the time, nothing too important had been stolen, except for the one time he had foolishly stored his winter coat in it. That coat had taken him a while to save up for, and losing it had left him awfully depressed. After that experience, Midoriya started using the tree knot to hold his items, knowing it would be far safer than his actual locker. The knot was deep enough that if any students had actually looked inside, they would be unable to see his stuff. The only way to confirm that something was in there was to reach inside, and most of the kids at his school weren't brave enough to do that. He reached inside and pulled out his lunch bag, the same one he had been using for years. He sat down against the trusty tree and began to eat, doing his job as well. Gami and the boy ended up rambling on about something unrelated to the prior event, which Midoriya was thankful for. The man seemed to know just when he needed a distraction. The rest of the day had gone pretty well. Midoriya managed to weave into the crowd when coming back from lunch, so he wasn't cornered again. And nothing too eventful had happened in the rest of his classes. It wasn't until the end of the day that things got messy. The dismissal bell rang, and again, the child let the rest of the class leave before eventually leaving himself. He was on his way to the courtyard when one of the windows caught his eye. He turned towards it and realized it showed the courtyard as well as a perfect view of the tree that stood in the center. Near the tree also stood Bakugo and a group of maybe 5 others. Luckily, they weren't snooping in the knot, but they seemed to be just standing around, like they were waiting. Then it clicked. They were waiting for him. He turned to run in the opposite direction, as he was sure they would leave after long enough. But as he did, the boy was positive he saw a head lurch in his direction. Praying they didn't spot him, Midoriya ran up the first flight of stairs. A stampede of footsteps behind him confirmed his worst fear. He raced down one of the hallways, listening as Bakugo's loud voice commanded the others to split up and corner him. He skidded down another hallway, the stairs to the 3rd floor in sight. His signature red sneakers squeaked loudly against the polished tile, alerting everyone of his location. He almost reached the door to the 2nd flight of stairs when one of the bullies jumped out in front of him from another hall. Midoriya dove under his outspread arms and rammed the door where the stairwell hid behind. He scrambled on all 4s up the stairs, desperately trying to regain his balance. He went up the stairs. The kid who tried to catch him bellowed. Midoriya frantically tried to think of a new place to hide. He immediately ruled out anywhere on the 3rd floor, as some kids would likely be waiting for him there. He considered the 4th floor, but decided against it for that same reason. But what else was there? The child gasped. The roof. The janitors were supposed to lock it once school ended, but they rarely ever did their job. Midoriya would just have to bank on the fact that it would be open. Otherwise, he'd be trapped in a dead end with 6 feral kids hellbent on kicking his ass. He picked up his pace and dashed further up the stairs. He could hear the shocked cries of the kids on the 3rd and 4th floors as he passed them completely. Good, he'd made the right choice. Now he had extra time to figure out what exactly he was going to do once he got to the roof. After all, it's not like he could really go anywhere else after that. Midoriya collided with the rooftop door and gave it a desperate push. To his outstanding relief, it swung open effortlessly, and he almost fell right onto the ground. He could hear the voices coming up faster now. He stumbled but recovered fast enough to look around. There wasn't anywhere to hide. He was trapped. The voices had reached the roof where he was. So had the footsteps. He turned around in a panic and watched as 5 kids that liked to hang around Bakugo emerged from the stairwell. They snickered at his panicked form and started to approach him. Midoriya began to back away as they did, but eventually ran into the railing that lined the rooftop. He looked back in shock, and 2 of the approaching kids quickly ran to his sides to seize his arms. The boy thrashed wildly at the touch, his mind spiraling in absolute agony. He hated this. The touches released something feral in his head. He hated being touched, especially out of his control. They needed to stop. Midoriya couldn't think. His mind was spinning. Let me go. Let me go. Let me go. Let me go. Let me. A sudden sock to the face snapped him out of it. He could feel the warm blood trickle down his face. He didn't think his nose was broken, but the thick trail of red was really starting to make him doubt it. The kid that had punched him laughed, and then gave him another sock to the gut. Midoriya gasped at that, choking on his own spit. The force of the blow knocked his head back and sent a few specks of blood flying off his face. His head lurched forward again and hung limply on his neck. The last 2 kids stayed by the rooftop door, watching everything play out. Then, a last set of loud and harsh footsteps made their way up the stairs. Midoriya lifted his head up to meet Bakugo's stare, his eyes fluttering and desperately trying to stay open. He yanked frantically on the 2 kids holding his arms, not sure if it was because of the touch or just to escape the current situation, but they didn't budge. Bakugo walked closer, shoving the kid that punched Midoriya out of the way. The other 2 kids followed close behind. Deku, he growled. The boy grimaced at the name, but kept eye contact with Bakugo. Kaken, please, I haven't even done anything today. The angry blonde scowled some more. You think you're all that, don't you? What are you even talking about? The grip around his arms tightened painfully, and Midoriya yelped. Watch it, Deku, one of the boys holding his arms said. Bakugo stepped even closer, until he was right at the child's face. But even then, the timid boy never broke eye contact, and that really pissed Bakugo off. What was he trying for? It's not like Deku could accomplish anything significant being quirkless, so why was he trying so hard? The blonde grinded his teeth, desperate to get some sort of reaction out of the child in front of him. He slapped his hand onto Midoriya's right shoulder and lit it up in a fiery rage. He could see the sparks leaking out from underneath his hand, now staining Midoriya's uniform. That did it. The boy's eyes tore away from Bakugo's own in unrestrained terror. The blonde had noticed that Midoriya seemed to have some sort of weak spot at his right shoulder, though he could never figure out what it was. But he was finally getting the reaction he wanted. He wanted Deku to know exactly where his place was. Midoriya howled at the spark on his shoulder. It reminded him so much of his father. Too much. He was barely keeping it together, the memories from that night spilling into the current moment. He could feel the tears threatening to breach his eyes, but did his best to hold them in. He couldn't cry now. He couldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing that they won. Then, Bakugo's hand lifted off after what seemed like forever. He could feel himself calm down at that, not realizing he had been thrashing crazily before, and that the 2 other students behind the blonde had to step in to keep him restrained. He opened his eyes to look at his former friend, but found no sympathy on his face, only hate. Midoriya could feel a hand in his hair, but recognized its cold feeling as Gami's. He tended to forget the man was there in situations similar to this. He tried to focus his mind on the way he softly ruffled his green locks, just as if the man was trying to tell him it would be okay, that it would be over soon. Bakugo kneed him in the gut violently. At that, the boy lunged over weakly, and the 4 kids holding his arms suddenly let go. He fell right to the floor face first as he had done earlier. Only this time, he didn't have the strength to hoist himself up. He stayed limp on the rooftop, barely able to lift his head to see Bakugo and the other 5 students make their way to the door. The kids stopped, clearly waiting for the blonde to lead them, but he also stopped at the doorway. He turned around to look at the prone Midoriya. "Remember your place, Deku," he stated, something he never failed to remind the boy. "A quirkless loser like yourself can't ever be a hero." And with those parting words, all of them left the rooftop. Midoriya pushed himself to his knees and slowly made his way to the railing where he had been cornered just before. The railing wasn't too high, only reaching to about his waist, but the bars holding it up were spread pretty widely apart. The boy slipped his legs through the spaces so they dangled off the edge. He would have climbed over the railing to sit on the thin ledge that separated safety and falling to his doom, but there wasn't enough room. Gami did the same, his robe flowing in the high wind. They sat there in silence for a bit, before the child broke it with a sob. The sobs grew louder and heavier until Midoriya could hardly breathe. He was crying so profusely that the sounds just stopped coming out. He brought his gloved hands to his mouth and simply kept them there, trying to drown out sobs that couldn't be heard. "I don't understand," were the first words to be spoken through the sobs, though they were muddy and almost inaudible. "Why do they hate me so much?" He could feel Gami's hand move from his head to his back, rubbing circles into it. The man didn't say anything though, opting to let the child continue ranting. "I can't do this anymore. Why can't I be free? Why can't this just be over?" The boy let his head rest against the railing, staring down 4 floors to the ground. It would be so easy, fast, painless, but it would never work. His role as death made sure of that. He had tried in the past, his thoughts going back to that moment. Gami had been trying to tell him something, but he was so desperate for release, he didn't listen. He ran into the bathroom and opened the medicine cabinet, downing as many things as he could find. After a few minutes, he was convinced he simply hadn't taken enough things. But then, Gami introduced him to another ability he had as death. Midoriya viewed it as more of a curse. He remembered Gami telling him, when he first got his powers, that each death was required to work for a minimum of a century. Now he knew how they enforced it. To put it simply, he had immortality. He couldn't die, no matter how much he craved it. He could still get hurt and burned and scarred, but he couldn't die. Gami had told him it was so death could work without any distractions. But Midoriya figured it was just a way to keep each death stuck in this invisible contract, so they really couldn't get out of their duties. It was cruel, and he hated it. Of course, after finding that out, he desperately didn't want to believe it. So he tried a few more times in a few different ways, but none of them ever worked. He remained stuck in this hellish nightmare. The boy snapped back into reality at the cold touch of the man's hand on his own. He didn't break eye contact with the ground though. "I never thought I wanted much in life, but," he started, not really knowing where his head was going with this. Gami turned to look at him, his hand still unmoving. "My whole life. I guess the few things I've wanted I can't have." Midoriya moved to look down at his gloved hand. "I guess I can add this to the list." But at those words, the child could feel soft sleeves wrap around him. It took him a second to figure out who was hugging him, despite Gami being the only other person on the roof. He hadn't been hugged in such a long time. It felt alien. He slowly wrapped his own arms around the man, unsure if he was doing it right. The two of them stayed like that for a bit, just silently reassuring themselves that they still had each other, if no one else. Izu, you and I both know you are going to become the greatest hero, and nothing will ever stop you, Gami finally said, breaking the quietness. Not them, not the world, and surely not this. Midoriya stayed quiet at that. But the man could hear the tiniest of sniffles coming from where the boy's head was perched in his robe. He smiled, though it went unnoticed, and hugged tighter. His successor was going to take the world by storm one day. Midoriya stumbled down the school's fire escape in a hurry. He didn't think he could take the stairwell back down. He had taken too long on the roof, and if the janitors caught him still in school after hours, it wasn't going to end well. So he opted for sliding down the rusty fire escape. After all, it was much safer than just jumping off the roof and waiting for his bones to heal in the morning. See, concerning his immortality, Midoriya has learned an important aspect about it much earlier in the past. The immortality didn't give him any regeneration factor, but healed any injuries that could prove detrimental to his job after an overnight's rest. Handy, but not too practical in the midst of a fight. So yes, while he could jump 4 stories off the roof of his junior high and be all right, he'd also be a pile of broken bones and mush until the morning. As for why he was in a rush, well, Gami had the decency to remind him that he was supposed to be at Ishihara's for tea in 10 minutes. Ever since saving the man from his unsightly demise, he would be invited over for tea and snacks around 1 or 2 times a week. He enjoyed Ishihara's company, as the two of them loved to chat about just anything, kind of like him and Gami. Plus, there were times where Ishihara would pull out his old chessboard, and while the older man would usually win, Midoriya loved it nonetheless. The boy learned a lot about Ishihara during their tea chats. The man apparently had a super neat tracking quirk he got to name under the radar. It allowed him to place undetectable, irremovable trackers on up to 3 items at once, even people. It didn't have a size or a range limit, and the trackers couldn't be removed unless Ishihara himself released them. All in all, Midoriya thought his quirk was absolutely amazing. The only downside to it was the man would go randomly blind at times, which led to the incident that caused the two to meet. But now wasn't the time for the child to be gushing about the man's quirk. He sprinted down the busy sidewalk, ignoring angry protests of commuters he bumped into along the way. Turning a corner, he now had the quaint, blue house in sight. The boy didn't have a watch or a phone, so he had no idea whether he was late or not. Hopefully he wasn't, though. Midoriya really didn't want Ishihara to start asking questions. He ran up the stairs and rang the doorbell. After a few seconds, the door clicked and opened up. "Oh, Midoriya, you made it right in time." The man's voice echoed from behind the wood. The child let out a sigh of relief. He'd made it in time. He looked up to meet Ishihara's eyes. "Oh my goodness, what happened to your face?" Midoriya reaches a gloved hand to touch at his face in confusion. He pulled it back only to find a decent amount of red staining it. Right, his nose. He'd assumed it had stopped bleeding by now. Guess it hadn't. The older man ushered him inside and shut the door behind his smaller form. The boy was pretty dazed during it all, but remembered Ishihara seating him on one of the dining room chairs and cleaning up his face. The man then got up to throw away the bloody tissue before getting a new one. "It was the kids at school, wasn't it?" He spoke softly. It seemed like a lot of people were doing that today. Midoriya didn't say anything back, but the way he looked away from Ishihara's concerned stare gave the man all the answers he needed. "Midoriya, I know you don't like talking about it, but can you at least tell me why they're hurting you?" The child's brows furrowed at that. Sure, he had known Ishihara for a good 3 years, but even then, how would he react to knowing the boy's biggest secret? Well, I guess it wasn't his biggest per se, but definitely the most detrimental. Would those 3 years of friendship go completely down the drain? Midoriya didn't want to risk that, ever. He looked back up at the man's eyes, and immediately regretted it. Staring into those eyes full of concern made his heart swell with guilt. The lump in his throat grew larger, and the boy was afraid he would start crying again. But it was either that or talk, and Midoriya refused to do the latter. So the tears fell down his face silently, and Ishihara moved quickly to wipe them away before they mixed with the blood from his nose. But even that wasn't enough for his conscience, apparently. I'm quirkless, he sputtered out. What was he doing? He tried to stop, but his mouth didn't listen. But I still want to be a hero and save people. Ishihara listened silently as he continued. The other K kids at school know, and they don't like it. That's when his mouth gave out on him, and he went back to crying. There it was. It was out. He waited for Ishihara to reject him like everyone else did. He would never get to enjoy tea and snacks or talk or play chess with him again. It was over. Oh, Midoriya. And for a second time that day, he felt arms wrap around him. I'm so sorry you have to go through that. He looked over to the man in shock. You're not mad. Then it was Ishihara's turn to look shocked. Why would I be mad? It's just cause, he murmured. Most people are when they find out. Well then, I guess I'm not most people, the older man reassured. Besides, you've already saved my life. You're a whole step ahead of those other kids. The child's face changed to one of confusion. You really don't care that I'm quirkless? Ishihara smiled. I meant what I said when we first met. Quirk or not, you are going to be a great hero one day, Midoriya. And that finally broke the dam as the boy bawled his eyes out. But with Ishihara at one side and Gami at the other, they were more tears of happiness than anything else. Midoriya fiddled on the couch, while Ishihara handed him a plate of chocolate chip cookies covered in plastic wrap. The man was nice enough to package away some of the spare treats he prepared. The two had enjoyed tea and those same chocolate chip cookies earlier after the man cleaned up the child's face, and Ishihara even whipped out his old chessboard. Of course, the older man still won the game, but the boy didn't really mind. Ishihara really did a good job of lifting his mood from the depressing mess it began as. But as all things, it came to an end when a small alarm by the living room TV rang. Oh well, 6 already, Ishihara sighed and looked at the small boy worryingly. You can stay a bit longer if you'd like. Midoriya shook his head vigorously. No, I'll be all right. He pushed himself off the couch, still feeling pain where he was punched earlier. Bakugo's follow-up attack didn't exactly help either. He hadn't found the time to check the area yet, but guessed a decently sized bruise now dressed it. He landed roughly on his feet, stumbling slightly, but catching himself on the armrest of the couch. Ishihara looked at him in concern, but the child flashed one of his signature bright smiles in reassurance. The man passed him the wrapped plate of cookies that Midoriya put on the couch so he could get up. Don't worry about bringing the plate back, the older man said. I've got plenty. The boy took the treats from Ishihara and held them close to his chest, afraid he'd drop them the second he left the house. Today had been a roller coaster of events as well as emotions. He still hadn't gotten his hands to stop sweating or his knees to stop shaking. But he wasn't hyperventilating anymore, and his heartbeat wasn't drowning out the rest of the world, so the child still considered it a win. During Midoriya's internal reflection, he had made his way to the front door, which Ishihara held open for him. Thank you for everything, Ishihara-san, he whispered out, just loud enough for the man to hear. It really means a lot to have your support. The older man smiled at that. Just make sure to remember your biggest fan when you go pro. Midoriya giggled. Gami may end up giving the man a run for his money, but Ishihara didn't need to know about that. The boy trotted down the front steps and started down the sidewalk, clutching his plate of cookies tightly. Gami followed behind, quiet as ever. See you Thursday, Ishihara called out from the doorway hopefully. After school? The child turned to look back, before displaying another heartwarming smile. Sure thing, see you then. Midoriya continued towards his house as he heard the wooden door click shut. Gami moved up to walk next to him, but didn't say anything. He looked at the man in confusion, but the silence remained. He shrugged it off and went back to gazing at the plate of cookies. Ishihara really knew how to bake, and the boy was grateful that the man shared it with him. He could count maybe 10, no 12 cookies under the plastic wrap. Oh, he couldn't wait to eat another one once he arrived back home. Izu. The child looked back at Gami expectantly, but continued to walk. When the man seemed to hesitate, he motioned for him to keep going. Do you remember what I said about being around to teach you the basics of your job? Midoriya nodded, still not being able to put the pieces together. And that I would finally be off to rest once you could handle yourself. Once the man finished, it finally clicked for the boy. No, not after all they'd been through together. Not after today. His heart couldn't take it. Sure, the child had Ishihara, but that was only a couple times a week. If Gami left, he'd really be alone. His hands were shaking profusely now and his grip on the plate slipped. But Midoriya didn't even care. He waited for the loud crash of the ceramic against the concrete sidewalk in hope the noise would shake him out of his head. But no sound came. He craned his neck to look down, expecting to see the plate shattered and the cookies spread out on the ground. But instead turned to see Gami knelt down. The plate lay in his hand, completely intact. He rose back up and outstretched his arm to hand the plate back. Izu, please, the man whispered. Just listen. Midoriya took the plate back teary-eyed. They threatened to fall again for the third time that day. But he nodded nonetheless and waited for him to continue. He would hear his friend out. Gami deserved that at the very least. What I said was true, even if it was all those years ago. He kept listening, despite the growing lump in his throat. And after these 7 years together, I know you are more than capable of handling yourself and this position. It was growing harder and harder to listen. The boy stopped walking, having to put all his focus on not bursting into tears. By those words I said so long ago, I should be ready to move on and finally enjoy peace after all these centuries. But the man paused, and Midoriya could hear him take an audible breath. He still dared not to look at him in fear of breaking down. I have grown to enjoy your company, Izu. And now, though I am technically dead, I have never felt more alive. Gami seemed to stumble over his words, and the child finally gained the courage to look his friend in the eyes. Or at least, where he presumed his eyes would be. It was impossible to see any of the man's face under that dark hood of his. I believe what I am attempting to convey is that I care for you, and I am not ready to move on just yet. Midoriya's eyes widened, and a few tears slipped from his grasp. You are more than just my successor. You are my friend, and I wish to be around as you grow. I wish to watch you spill your cereal each morning, and hopefully change your breakfast tastes to be more than just Mighty Smacks. I wish to watch hero cartoons together when we get back in time to catch them. I wish to have more conversations that seep into the late night about quirks or heroes or whatever had plagued the day. I wish to support you as you continue fighting for your dream. The man fiddled with his long sleeves, picking at them from the inside with his bony fingers. He hadn't imagined this conversation to be as hard as it currently was. He broke eye contact with the boy standing in front of him. Not like anyone could tell. I want to be there when you become the greatest hero Japan has ever seen. Gami lifted his head up at the first few sniffles, but was completely unprepared when his successor embraced him in a crushing hug. The plate of cookies on the sidewalk. He hadn't heard them break, so the child must have placed them down. You really mean that? Midoriya whimpered out, eyes puffy, cheeks red, face utterly soaked in salty tears. I don't want you to stay if that makes you unhappy. You're my friend, Gami. I just want you to be happy. The man did make out what the boy was trying to say, though it was nearly inaudible due to his guttural sobs and hoarse voice. I meant every word. Gami couldn't recognize the voice that just spoke. It was so full of emotion. Was he crying? He truly had no idea. I want to stay. It was quiet, except for Midoriya's sobs. They merely stood in the center of the empty sidewalk embracing, a plate of plastic-wrapped cookies at their feet. If any person was watching, it would seem pretty weird that a small middle schooler had stopped abruptly in the middle of an empty sidewalk with a plate of cookies on the ground near his feet. It would probably seem even weirder that the same child was currently hugging himself while crying loudly. But Midoriya didn't mind. He didn't mind at all. Get back. Midoriya rushed over to the crowd of curious bystanders, watching in awe as a giant, rampaging villain tore apart a shopping district. The 14-year-old looked back quickly to check on his friend, who was weaving between people despite being able to pass through them. The boy tried his best to push through the crowd as politely as he could, finally reaching the front. Pro Hero Backdraft was doing his best to manage the mass of civilians with his water hose quirk, keeping them distanced from the fight. Midoriya stretched behind him to grab at his worn backpack, not taking his eyes off the fight as he pulled out a notebook and pencil without even looking. His eyes flashed at the hero fighting, Kamui Woods, before flipping to a specific page and jotting feverishly. Wow, it's the popular young star Kamui Woods, the teen exclaimed. I can't believe I managed to catch him in action. Haha, a running commentary, huh? A bystander with 3 pointed star-looking shapes extruding from his head chuckled. Are you a fanboy? Midoriya shifted in embarrassment, becoming a bit uncomfortable as he realized how close he was to the rest of the crowd. But at Gami's sudden touch to his shoulder, he relaxed more and went back to writing. No, he tried to explain. I just really enjoy taking notes on quirks. He then started murmuring quietly about the hero's quirk, Arbor. The quirk was a transformation class, but very flexible and beneficial in most situations. Midoriya speculated how the hero could apply his branch's binding capabilities in situations other than capture. Then, as Kamui Woods bent down, he realized the hero was about to perform his signature move. Take him down, Tree Man! The bystander from before yelled. Here it comes, it's his preemptive binding, Midoriya cried. Lacquered chain prison, Kamui finished, shooting off his branches as he extended his arms towards the massive villain. The villain roared in shock and flinched back at the enormous amount of branches plowing towards him. Canyon Cannon. A giant woman, larger than even the villain, suddenly appeared out of nowhere and kicked the villain right in the jaw. Midoriya gasped, startled by the new hero's sudden appearance, before snapping right back into action, flipping to a new page and writing out notes of the new quirk. Cameras behind the two flashed as they tried to snap a picture of the new female hero. Gami shuddered in annoyance and moved to stand at the boy's side rather than behind him. Today's my debut, the lady shouted as she shrunk back to normal size, but not before shaking her rear. Pleased to meet you all. You can call me Mount Lady. The now proclaimed Mount Lady moved to stand next to the restrained villain and waved towards the largest crowd of cameras. She flashed a wide smile as a single cameraman from the group came up to her to get some close-up shots of the new hero and the villain. Kamui Woods remained on the perch he was just fighting on, crouched and dejected at his spotlight being stolen. Wow, gigantification, huh? Midoriya muttered under his breath as he scribbled into his notebook. It's a common and quite powerful quirk, but could the threat of public property destruction limit its use? Maybe if... Well, it would depend on whether or not she can manipulate her size at will, Gami added after staying quiet for most of the fight. Ah yes, the teen whispered even quieter than before. He didn't want to seem like a crazy person at responding to seemingly nothing. Taking notes, huh? The man with the protruding shapes asked, not noticing the boy's last response. I guess you want to be a hero yourself. Good luck. Midoriya perked up at that compliment, his eyes lighting up. Gami shifted to put his arm in front of his successor. His eyes opposingly narrowed compared to his friends, even though no one could see it under his hood. much less actually see him in general. No one normally praised the boy, so the ghost was quite weary when it happened, especially since the other children at Aldera would pretend to compliment him only to see the dejected look on his face once they took it back. But his successor seemed to take the praise well, so the man backed off a bit. "Thank you," he responded happily. "I'll try my best." "I hate to interrupt Izu," Gami interjected, "but we are going to be late if you stay any longer." "Oh, you're right," he exclaimed, forgetting that no one else could hear the man standing near him. The bystander gave him a strange look, but Midoriya didn't notice. He scrambled back through the crowd, ignoring the shudders that rushed through him each time he bumped someone's arm. He really didn't enjoy crowds, but the rush of watching a fight was too much to resist sometimes. Besides, once he heard on the news that Kamui Woods was fighting, he was all too eager to remember his fear of contact. He had been very interested in the young hero's quirk, especially his signature move, and while he did look up as much information as possible, nothing could compete with seeing it in action. And while he certainly wasn't expecting to see the debut of a promising new hero, Midoriya was extremely glad he had decided to bear the mass of bystanders in the end. Running down another busy street, he pondered the new hero to keep his mind off the fact that the sidewalks were much too crowded for his liking. Her giantification quirk was certainly a marvel to see in person, not something video feed could really do justice. But he hadn't noticed any support gear on her costume. The teen guessed that the costume itself had to be made of an extremely elastic material for her to shrink back to normal without any problems. But that was pretty much all he noticed. And yes, he considered that the new Mount Lady was going for a more destructive style, and that kind of fighting didn't really permit much support gear, especially with a gigantification quirk. But for him, that didn't negate the benefits that support gear brought. He could think of many different items that could work with her changing size, such as an elastic rope or whip that stretched and shrunk with her. That kind of weapon would be easy to make and allow the hero to make more precise attacks without worrying about damaging public property. Plus, if there was ever a situation where she couldn't fit between buildings, the whip would allow her to still contribute to the fight. Of course, there was always the notion that her costume was made of purely skin-tight elastic, simply to boost her ratings with the male population. That was the trap many female pro heroes fell into, whether they knew it or not. Most costume designers were male after all, and you couldn't deny that they may have slipped some personal ideas into their work. Sure, some female pros did use this fact to their advantage, like Uwabami, the snake hero who was also a television celebrity. Her charming looks as well as her celebrity status often made working with police and rescuing civilians easier. But Midoriya hoped that heroes were more modest than that. After all, for him it was more about saving people than popularity. The seductive pose that Mount Lady flashed for the cameras pretty much dashed any ideas of modesty for the new hero. For goodness sake, even the nice bystander who complimented him had been drooling at the sight. Midoriya pushed forward. He could see his middle school now. If he kept at this pace, he was sure he wouldn't be late. Keeping his current pace wouldn't be so hard though. The boy's nightly endurance runs made sure of that. Plus, constantly running from Bakugo and his group helped out even more. As long as he left school early, they never managed to catch up to him. Of course, his endless stamina didn't really help when the bullies cornered him during the school day, but it was still helpful overall. But right now, as long as he didn't bump into any of the solo pedestrians, he would make it on time. He wasn't going to be late. That put a small smile on his face. "You guys are all third years now," Midoriya's homeroom teacher called out. The boy had arrived at school 5 minutes early, much to the displeasure of the other students. The teacher hadn't been in the classroom, so Midoriya was able to slink in without hearing any berating, despite the fact that he wasn't late. The day had gone pretty smoothly, with the team managing to avoid Bakugo and the others at spots where they normally cornered him, like on his way to the courtyard. He was in a cheerful mood and was hoping to end the day with it. This last class of the day wasn't too bad either. The teacher was trying to go over plans for the future. It's time to start thinking seriously about your futures, the teacher continued, grabbing a stack of papers lying on his desk. Midoriya knew exactly where he wanted to go with his future, but he also knew that his classmates, even the school itself, didn't support him. He didn't want to attract any unnecessary attention to himself, though. So the boy sank into his chair in an attempt to make himself smaller. He was still writing in the notebook from earlier. Him and Gami had been talking about the fight at lunch, and the man brought up some great points concerning the new hero, as well as the teen explaining his ideas for potential support gear. Gami hadn't been able to finish his thoughts before the bell rang, so the man was talking to the boy now, despite the fact that the teacher was also talking. Midoriya wasn't too concerned with whatever the teacher was rambling on about now, taking the time to scribble each idea the spirit was giving him. This was one of the times he was thankful that no one else could hear Gami, even though it was pretty awkward when the teen responded to him out loud and someone else heard. I would hand out these future career forms, but… He shook the stack of paper he had picked up in the air. He then slammed both his hands onto the face of his desk, along with the papers, startling Midoriya out of his personal conversation. Thankfully, the boy didn't make any significant noise or catch anyone's attention, but now was focused on what exactly the teacher was doing. I assume you all want to be heroes, the teacher exclaimed and swung his hand back towards the chalkboard, scattering the career forms everywhere. His class cheered out and all started showing off their quirks. Midoriya liked looking at his peers' quirks. He thought each one was unique and could be used for hero work in their own way. Gami, too, stopped talking and looked around at the variety of quirks being shown. He wasn't as impressed as his successor, however, having seen quirks similar to these over his centuries of work. At first, he was surprised that Bakugo didn't join in on the fun and glanced over to see the blonde looking smug with his feet on his desk. He was going to do something brash. Midoriya just knew it. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, the man sighed, trying to get his class to calm down. But you know that it's against the rules to use them at school. The teen glanced over to look at Gami, who was now standing beside his desk, rather than behind him as he usually stood. The man seemed to be staring right at Bakugo, however, almost taking a defensive stance. The boy turned to follow Gami's stare. The blonde was now grinning widely compared to his small smirk before. Oh, now he knew Kaken was going to do something. Sensei, the angry blonde yelled, don't lump me in with these losers. The class shut up at that. As if I had anything like their awful quirks, he sneered and leaned back into his chair. The class erupted into chaos again. Midoriya and the spirit watched as the students booed and shouted, desperate to prove themselves and heal their damaged pride. They reminded the small teen of a pack of hyenas trying to jump a lion. Bakugo then bursted into laughter. Shut up, extras. Ah yes, Bakugo, you of course, the teacher announced over the loud wailing of his students. Must be aiming for Yua High School. The room grew even louder, comments flying overhead like runaway kites. Midoriya shrunk further into his seat. He was sure the teacher knew he was also aiming for Yua and hoped that the man didn't use that information to embarrass him, as easy as it would be. Gami stepped closer to his successor's desk, fearing something bad to come and ready to offer support. I aced the mock exam, the blonde continued, jumping up out of his chair and landing on top of his desk. I'm the only one here with the stuff for Yua. The boy would never comment that he also aced the mock exam. The class wouldn't care about that, only the fact that a quirkless kid was trying to get into the best hero school in the country. Besides, he had gotten all the praise he needed from Gami and Ishihara concerning the mock exam. I'll even surpass All Might and become the best hero out there. Midoriya scoffed at that, though it was unlike him. Leave it to Kaken to challenge the #1 pro hero in all of Japan. Not to mention, I'll be one of the richest people in the world. At that, Midoriya and Gami rolled their eyes, though one was completely invisible. Both went unnoticed, however. Bakugo's yelling and the chaos of the rest of the class thoroughly took the attention off of them. And that's just how the team preferred it. He really didn't want all of his peers' eyes on him, especially when it would end up being more than just eyes. "Aren't you also going for Yua Midoriya?" The teacher's words swept over the room like a plague. Bakugo stopped shouting immediately, standing atop his desk completely still, as if someone had broken him. The smile on his face fell almost instantly. The class had gone completely silent, all turning to look at him in shock. Their stares burned into him like hot coal. Gami pushed his hand onto his successor's desk, eyes leering at the rest of the people in the room. He wished he was alive in that one moment, just so he could trample across the room and smack the smirk right of the teacher's face, and throw every single desk that got in his way. No one messed with his successor, his friend. No one. Midoriya wanted to curl up and die in that moment. He could see his teacher's smug grin, just as if he wanted this to happen. His hands started shaking underneath his desk, but he faced the class head-on. He would not give in to them today. The class exploded with laughter, all directed at him. It startled the young teen, but he didn't show it. He just shifted his eyes to look at his desk, instead of the disapproving glares of his classmates. Bakugo jumped from his desk suddenly, hands starting to spark. "Come on, Deku," he screamed, his anger fueling his quirk, causing a decent-sized explosion to burst from his palms. The blast knocked over Midoriya's desk and sent the boy flying into the back wall. He let out a gasp at hitting the wall roughly and slumped down. Bakugo followed the boy and scowled, while the teacher and students did absolutely nothing but watch. "Forget those extras quirks," he berated. "You're quirkless, and you think you can rub shoulders with me." Midoriya flinched at how close Bakugo got to his limp form. Wait, no, Kaken. You really think a school like Yua would let a quirkless wannabe like you even try? The boy looked down at that. He already knew Yua wouldn't even consider him as a hero student once they saw his records read quirkless. Midoriya had gone through a lot of trouble to get his official records changed just to avoid that. If anyone looked into his official records, his quirk was Reaper, and it allowed him to decay things at a touch and summon a scythe. That's it. He kept it as minimal as possible to avoid suspicion. Besides, his other abilities, like premonition and the soul stuff, wasn't something that could be easily picked out in a fight. Midoriya didn't answer, and Bakugo was starting to get angry. The students continued to stare, and some of the blonde's group got out of their seats and moved to stand behind him. Gami stood protectively in front of the fallen boy, trying to shield him from whatever the angry teen might do, even though no one could see him. Midoriya smiled softly at his friend's actions, hoping no one saw, but he wasn't lucky enough for that. "What are you smiling at, Deku?" Bakugo growled. A chorus of "Yas" and "Dekus" followed suit. "What can you even do?" The boy looked down at the floor, and he swore he heard the spirit growl back at the children surrounding them. But as much as he appreciated the gesture, his mood was spoiled. He could only sit there as they laughed and laughed and laughed, struggling to hold his tears in. Midoriya had always been a natural crier, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction they wanted. Not now. Not ever. The incident promptly ended after a few moments, the bell ringing and the teacher letting the class out. Midoriya lifted himself off the ground and hobbled over to his desk, ignoring any wandering stares in his direction. His phone buzzed in his back pocket, and he excitedly reached to pull it out, happy it didn't break on his rough impact with the wall. Midoriya could finally say that he owned a phone after about 9 months of saving up for one. That was also with taking up extra jobs that neighboring communities would offer him, more than he usually did to survive. He didn't mind the extra work, and Gami suggested that investing in a phone wouldn't be a bad idea. The teen put off the idea of buying one for a while, as they were reasonably expensive, and he didn't really need to get in contact with anyone on a daily basis. But now that he was going into high school, he figured he might need one, especially if he got into UA. "Oh wow," he whispered, half to avoid the attention of his peers, half so Gami would realize he was talking to him. "The incident this morning is blowing up all over the news." "Indeed. I assume Mount Lady's new appearance is really taking the spotlight." "Yeah, let me just grab my notebook and we can go." Midoriya smiled and reached for the thin book with a big No. 13 written on the cover in thick marker. It was the same book he had been writing in earlier this morning at the fight. It held plentiful notes on various quirks that the boy found interesting. He enjoyed scouring the news or the internet for heroes with marvelous quirks, occasionally picking out some underground heroes to research. They had some of the most amazing powers he'd ever heard of, and he was often bummed that no one praised them as much as they deserved. And true to the title, he had 12 more notebooks at home. Suddenly, the notebook was snatched from his hand. Midoriya wasn't expecting the intervention and shrieked, his hand flinching back into his chest. "We're not done here, Deku," Bakugo snarled as the classroom emptied out, waving the notebook in the air by his thumb and pointer finger. "What's that, Katsuki?" one of his lackeys asked with a smirk on his face. Another turned his head to read what was on the cover. "For the future?" "Seriously? What future?" "See, come on," Midoriya cried, lunging slightly at Bakugo's outstretched hand. "Give it back." The blonde, being decently taller than the green-haired teen, easily kept the book out of his reach. Then, Bakugo brought the notebook between both his hands, and in a flash, lit it up. Midoriya let out a loud wail at the sight of his work being exploded, not even being able to see it through the smoke and fire. The light was so blinding he had to look away for a moment to regain his focus, and glancing back, saw Gami flinching away from the light as well. The man, despite being a spirit, severely disliked bright lights. The boy didn't really know if it was a personal thing or a ghost thing, but noticed it nonetheless. Now, despite that fact, Gami still adorned what the teen thought was a scowl. For the first time in a while, Midoriya could clearly see the thin, bony hands that normally hid in the man's long sleeves, reaching out in a threatening manner at Bakugo. And while Gami was certainly channeling the anger he felt as well, the boy felt more despair than anything else. "Why?" he whimpered in anguish, his cries going unheard. The angry blonde spared him a slight glance, before letting out a short breath, then tossing the burnt book out of the open window. The boy let out an even louder cry, scrambling to the window in an attempt to catch it before it landed. Sadly, his efforts were fruitless as he watched his work land into a man-made fish pond. Gami watched as his successor visibly crumbled, still trying to hold in his waterworks. The man swiped at Bakugo's head, though it just went right through the blonde. "I'll be the first and only hero from this crappy middle school," he continued, as if nothing had happened. "So in other words..." Bakugo made his way over to Midoriya, the pair snickering in the background. He placed his hand onto the teen's right shoulder, right where the scar from his father laid. He let out a shaky breath at the contact, especially at by who and where it was. He watched as the blonde's hand started to smoke, and fought off the urge to rip the hand off him. He hated when Bakugo did this. "I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. I hate it. Don't even try for Yua, understand?" Midoriya's lip quivered, his mind racing. He looked up to see Gami behind the blonde, directing him to control his breathing. He followed the man, taking an unstable breath in and letting out a wobbly sigh. Then, Bakugo's hand was gone, and him and the other two kids were on their way out of the classroom. The green-haired boy continued to stand still, not trusting his legs in the moment. He looked down at the ground, and Gami knelt down to keep eye contact, still instructing the boy's breathing. All that could be heard was soft, staggered breathing, not a single quip back from Midoriya. "Typical. Come on, say something," one of the kids remarked. "He can't say anything," the other replied. He's so lame. Even as a third year, he still can't face reality. Midoriya's hand tightened on one of his worn backpack straps, fighting between lunging at the children and dropping to the floor in agony. He could see his reality. He could. He insisted to himself that he was gifted with something special, and the boy would use it to save lives. He could. He would. So why did he feel like crying right now? You want to be a hero so bad? God, did Bakugo ever know when to just shut up? I got an idea for you. Midoriya thought he must have recoiled or something, because he could hear a scoff come from the blonde as he continued. Though, it could have just been Bakugo amused at the thought of his coming remark. Just hope for a quirk in your next life, he declared, and go take a swan dive off the roof. Thankfully, the three of them left the classroom fairly quickly after that, and didn't hear the teen fall to his knees. They didn't hear his choked sobs as he lost all progress in regaining his normal breathing. They didn't hear a loud screech against the floor as Gami lunged at them in unrestrained rage, passing through them and colliding with a desk instead. They also didn't hear a centuries-old ghost curse out the universe for his temperamental solidity. Though, nobody heard Midoriya under his breath, desperately wishing he wasn't as ungodly immortal as he was. The boy didn't stay alone in the classroom for long, as much as he wanted to. He composed himself well enough to make his way to the fish pond where his notebook was, though the janitors wouldn't ask even if his face was blotchy. He arrived at the pond, only to find a fish nibbling at the corner of his prized possession. That's not food, stupid fish, he cursed. That's my notebook. He lifted the soggy book out of the water and carefully flipped through the pages. The ink was ruined. He couldn't even make out the words. All of today's notes, Kamui Wood's signature move, the new Mount Lady's gigantification quirk, and the rest of the writings he had in there, gone forever. He wanted to cry even more. I can still read it, Gami piped up. That is definitely not the most illegible writing I have seen in my years of work. Wait, really? Midoriya sniffled. Yes, and if we get home soon, I can translate it for you. Thank you. Thank you so much. He lunged over to hug the man tightly. They stayed silent for a bit, as they usually did during one of these moments. You will prove them all wrong one day, Izuku. The man carefully strung his words together. Don't let them get in your head. I know, the boy added quickly, but it doesn't make the words hurt any less. He wearily shook out his wet notebook before placing it gently into his backpack. Midoriya started his way towards home, wishing he could visit Ishihara today instead of the plan tomorrow. Gami didn't hesitate to follow him, walking at his side instead of behind. He could feel his successor holding onto the end of his long sleeve, not that he minded. It was something the boy usually did in states of high distress. I'm just going to keep my chin up, Midoriya spoke after a while, in a determined voice that didn't match his body language. And keep moving forward, no matter what they say. The spirit walking beside him smiled warmly at that, though no one could see. They approached what looked to be the tunnel underneath a small bridge. It was dark and eerie, and gave both the boy and his mentor a dangerous vibe. Be careful, Izuku. Something is not right here. I picked up on it too, but I will. Midoriya took a slow step inside, hands ready to defend himself. After a few moments of silence, he took another, landing on a manhole cover leading to the city sewers. He paused again, looking all around him for an attack. He didn't notice the sewer cover start to leak. Suddenly, a massive amount of sludge bursted from the holes in the cover, completely enveloping the boy's small form. Perfect, the sludge panted. A medium-sized body to hide in. The teen cried out in shock, but the sludge quickly silenced him by stuffing itself down his throat. A villain. Midoriya used his one free hand to grab at the sludge in his mouth, but it was no use. The fluid was just slipping through his fingers. Gami tried clawing at the villain as well, but his spiritual form proved detrimental. Tugging at his successor didn't help either, The boy was completely stuck. "Thanks, kid," the villain monologued. "You're a real hero. I never thought he'd show up in this." "What do I do?" Midoriya thought. "I can't breathe and I'm only getting weaker." He knew that he wouldn't die, but that still left an unwanted house guest puppeting his body. He stared right into the eyes of the villain as more fluid shoved itself into his mouth. Wait, his eyes. The boy looked back at the faded yellow eyes hidden in the sludge. The sludge may not be solid, but his eyes must be. He just had to bank on that. As bad as he felt for doing this, Midoriya shot his free hand towards one of the eyes of the villain. He shoved his fingers right into them, and the villain flinched, but held strong. "You're not getting away that easily," he cackled. Luckily for Midoriya, that wasn't his plan. After a few seconds or so, the villain felt his eye start to burn up. Surely the boy hadn't poked him too hard, right? But after another couple moments, it became more than just irritation. "Ah, my eye," he roared in pain, releasing Midoriya to cradle his wound. The teen jumped back at his newfound freedom, not wasting his chance. Gami rushed over to his successor in concern. He just nodded in reply, not really being able to speak due to the just previous suffocation. The villain screamed again. "I can't see. What did you do?" Midoriya stopped Death's touch at that point. He didn't need to decay the entire eye to handicap the villain in front of him. Though looking back at the sludge, he realized he may have gone a bit overboard in his panic. Half of the eye was missing, leaving the remaining fluid to slowly ooze into the sludge on that side of his face. The villain was desperately trying to fill the new gap with his slime to stop the leaking, all while continuing to scream in pain. The boy would have felt bad if it weren't for the fact that the same villain was just trying to stuff himself down his throat. The boy flexed his hand, summoning a large scythe, the blade almost resembling a bird's beak, as a hole near the top could be mistaken for the bird's eye. Gami had told him a while back that he could summon a weapon to fight with, if need be. It was mostly to keep the aesthetic, as Death didn't go out and reap souls anymore, but still real and useful for slicing. Midoriya hadn't had too many chances to whip it out and practice, but he found it came naturally to him. He gripped the weapon confidently with both hands, and swung it at the villain's midsection. The blade cut cleanly through the sludge, and flung a good portion of the goo onto the tunnel wall, having the villain sized. The villain didn't seem to be in any more pain because of it, so Midoriya figured the best way to incapacitate him would be aiming for the solid parts, which he could now see were his eyes and mouth. In a desperate attempt to retaliate, the villain lurched out a tentacle of slime at the teen. He flexed his hand again, and the side disappeared so he could roll roughly out of the way. He quickly summoned the weapon again and slashed at the appendage that had attacked him, slicing it clean off. It splattered onto the ground like wet paint. Midoriya made his next move. Of course, he didn't want to kill the villain, so in his next swing, he turned his scythe so the flat part of the blade was plowing towards the mouth hidden in the sludge. The sheer force that came off each swing seemed unreasonable for a boy of his stature, even if the boy was fit, but he wasn't complaining. The flat blade crashed into the villain's mouth just as he intended it to, and the sludge let out one last shriek of pain before spatting into the wall right next to the other half of his body. The goo oozed down and piled up on the ground, making Midoriya tense, but it didn't reform. The villain was out cold. Midoriya had won. He had single-handedly stopped a villain. As much as he wanted to, he couldn't celebrate now. Who knew when the villain was going to wake up? So the boy threw his backpack to the ground and opened it up, searching for something to contain the sludge in. A water bottle or something. But alas, he had nothing. Freaking out a bit and still on his high of adrenaline, the teen wondered what to do. "Hey Izu, I think you can use this," Gami yelled as he pointed towards two empty plastic liter bottles, lying on top of an overflowing trash bin. "Yeah, I think that might work," his successor cried as he ran over to the basket. Ignoring the awful stench that came from the pile, Midoriya grabbed the bottles that lay on top. Sprinting back over to the prone villain, he started scooping up the goo and shoving it into one of the bottles, much like how the villain tried to force his way into his own body. Midoriya didn't mean to, but the irony of the moment made him smirk. He pushed past the uncomfortable feeling of the wet sludge at his fingertips and kept shoveling it into the container. The boy was about halfway there when a sudden noise came from the other end of the tunnel. He readied himself for another villain, maybe the sludge man's accomplice, and leaned his hand in preparation to summon his scythe. I am here. All Might had been trailing the sludge villain since an incident this morning. The man still in his casual clothes and carrying a bag of groceries. His chase had led the hero to the underpass, but he unfortunately had to stop for medical reasons and hadn't gotten the chance to confront the villain. Jumping down, now completely buff, the man was ready to pummel some sludge. He certainly hadn't expected to see a small middle school teenager on his knees staring right back at him, scooping the villain's sludge into a large bottle with his offhand. "Ooh, hello, citizen." The man was unsure of what to say. Midoriya made no move at the sight of the number one hero, not even the slightest reaction. Gami looked over to the boy, figuring he must be in shock. Then, as he expected, his successor exploded. "Oh my goodness," the teen exclaimed, not bothering to get off his knees or stop collecting slime. "All Might." "Ah yes, that is me," the hero replied awkwardly, turning the conversation elsewhere and finally speaking at a normal volume. "Did you take out this villain by yourself?" At that, Midoriya shuffled, looking bashful. "Oh well, he attacked me on my way from school. I just did what I had to do." All Might didn't respond right away, instead taking a moment to observe the situation in front of him. There was still sludge on the wall and ground, as well as in the boy's hands. The bottle the teen was holding was nearly filled with sludge, and the hero winced slightly at the sight of the student trying to force one of the villain's eyes into the mouth of the bottle. "Here, let me assist you, civilian," the man cried as he lowered himself and picked up the second empty bottle. "Ah, thank you, All Might." The two spent a few minutes cleaning up the gooey mess, with Gami watching comically in the background. Midoriya finished much faster than the hero, since he had started well before All Might arrived. So he capped the bottle tightly and left it near the man before making his way towards his backpack lying on the ground. He opened up the worn zipper and scoured through it. The teen searched for something for his idol to sign, but all he really had of worth was his ruined notebook. Sighing in discontent, he pulled out that item and closed the bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the spirit, who had been watching in the background, finally approach him. Midoriya smiled as he felt Gami give him a sincere pat on the back. A silent, "good job," hung in the air. The boy snapped back to attention at the sight of All Might rising, now with both filled bottles in his hand. "Oh you, All Might," he stuttered out, hoping to catch the hero before he left. "I was hoping you could sign this for me." The pro turned to face the young man who had so valiantly taken down this troublesome villain, a large smile adorning his face. "Of course." He put the bottles in his cargo pant pockets before reaching into his back pocket, pulling out a black pen, and signing his name on one of the blank pages of the damaged notebook. "You know, young man," the hero started, "you did an excellent job in taking down such a potentially dangerous villain." Really?" Midoriya stammered in shock and awe. His idol was praising him. It was like a dream come true. "Indeed," All Might shouted, before returning to a more reasonable volume. "You will most definitely make a great hero one day." The teen almost cried at those words. All of the negative comments from across the years dissolved at his idol's praise. He could see Gami shift uncomfortably, weary of the praise, but his successor dismissed him with a slight wave of his hand. The hero handed the signed notebook back to the teen, before moving to escape the underpass. He really needed to leave. He could feel his body start to give out on him. He wouldn't be able to hold his form for much longer. Now I must bring this felon to the authorities. So I must be heading off. No, All Might couldn't leave just yet. Sure, Midoriya had gotten his praise, but he needed to know. He needed to know the answer to the question that had plagued his life for 14 years. Hold on, the boy cried. I need to ask you something. I really must go, young man. The hero insisted, bending down to prepare for launching off. He needed to leave. Now. Please, at school, I get picked on. The pro-hero froze at that. Midoriya knew that picked on was definitely an understatement. But he took the silence as a cue to keep going. I want to be a hero. I think saving people is the most amazing thing someone can do. The teen shuffled nervously, opting to look at his feet rather than at his idol. He didn't notice the man starting to smoke. Crap. I need to wrap this up quickly. The seasoned hero thought. But I don't exactly have a quirk. All Might swung his head back at the young boy at that last comment. Now listen, young man. I get hurt all the time during my hero work. He made a scuffling noise, which brought Midoriya's attention up off the floor. The man lifted up his shirt, revealing a large wound that resembled a spider web. The boy shuddered at the sight of the gruesome injury. Gami didn't like where this was headed and put his hand onto his successor's shoulder where it comfortably sat. He squeezed it lightly, trying to tell his friend that they should leave. The teen didn't notice. 5 years ago, an enemy did this to me, the smoking hero said relatively quickly. My respiratory system was nearly destroyed and my stomach had to be removed. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. Wait, wasn't that with the fight with Toxic Chainsaw? The hero chuckled uncomfortably. Well, you know your stuff. But no. It was another villain. I asked that this was never made public. I'm sure you can understand why. All Might paused for a moment, before feeling for the bottles in his pockets. The smoking was getting even worse now. He couldn't stay for much longer. Look, kid, he stated bluntly, losing the respectable young man. I'm the #1 hero, and I still got hurt. Without a quirk, you don't stand a chance. Both Gami and Midoriya tensed at that, for different reasons. The spirit tugged again on the boy's shoulder, but he didn't move. The teen just stood there, wide-eyed with shock. The boy stammered, trying to explain since the hero cut him off earlier. He wanted to tell the man about his abilities despite his lack of a quirk. Maybe he should have started with that. If you want to help people, the hero interrupted again, oblivious to the situation in front of him. Becoming a police officer isn't a bad option. Sure, they're often mocked, but it is admirable work. But a hero? It's just not possible without a quirk. All Might turned away from the student in front of him, crouching down for a second time. It's not wrong to dream, he continued. However, you need to be realistic. And with that last comment, the hero launched himself off the ground, his buff, smoking form becoming nothing more than a shrinking sight in the sky. Midoriya just stood and watched as his idol flew off into the day, completely silent as the shock of the situation finally set in. It was so quiet, Gami almost didn't notice the fat tears that streamed down the boy's face, the drops splashing against the paved ground. As heavily as they came down, there was still no sound. That was, until the teen's knees buckled, and he lost all strength in his legs. Gami reacted quickly, scooping up his successor underneath his arms. The teen just hung limply in the spirit's arms, barely registering the feeling of his soft sleeves in his hands, as he clutched them for dear life. His tears still ran down his cheeks, and the ghost could feel them soak into his sleeves, but he just continued to cradle the distraught child. The silence was finally broken by sobs and pained breaths, as the boy brought his hands up from the sleeves around him to cover his face. The two of them simply stayed right in that spot, Midoriya's burnt notebook lying face up on the ground, teasing them with a sight of All Might's signature. The boy didn't dare look down at it. The thought alone pulled at his heart. He wished he had taken a different way home. He wished he had left when Gami had tried to pull him away. He wished he had continued to live in ignorant bliss of his idol. Never meet your heroes, because they're sure to disappoint you.